Picture this. You're holding a small, sun-baked piece of clay in your palm. It's cool to the touch, rough in some places, smooth in others. Carved across its surface are rows of intricate markings, wedge-shaped symbols pressed into the clay thousands of years ago by hands not so different from your own. This isn't just a relic, it's a message, a legal decree, a contract, a royal proclamation etched in time, waiting to be understood. These ancient tablets are far more than artifacts. They're time capsules, preserving the very DNA of human civilization. They carried the weight of law, the promise of order, and the dreams of empires long turned to dust. And today, we're going to read them. For centuries, these tablets lay buried, silent witnesses to history's greatest untold stories. They held laws that shaped justice, governance, and society in ways modern legal systems are still catching up to. They recorded the first attempts to balance power with compassion, to protect the weak, to manage resources, and to hold people accountable. This is the story of how fragile pieces of clay became the guardians of humanity's earliest rules that decided life and death, fairness and injustice, order and chaos. And it's a story that continues to shape our world today. In this video, we'll journey across millennia, uncovering how these tablets were made, who wrote them, and what they really say. We'll meet kings like Hammurabi and Ur-Nammu, explore forgotten cities like Eshnunna, and walk through the courtrooms and marketplaces where these laws came alive. We'll see how ancient scribes turned wet clay into lasting justice, how treaties between empires were sealed with oaths to the gods, and how concepts we take for granted, like property rights, workers' protections, and even public health laws, were being carefully inscribed while much of the world was still in darkness. By the end, you won't just understand history, you'll feel it, and you'll see why something as simple as a clay tablet still matters in a world of digital clouds and instant information. So let's begin where every great story does, at the dawn of written law. Before words were written, law was spoken. It lived in the memory of elders, in the rulings of chieftains, and in the stories passed down through generations. But memory is fragile, and spoken word is fluid. It can change with the teller, be forgotten, or be deliberately twisted for power. As the first great cities of Mesopotamia began to rise from the fertile land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, this oral tradition simply wasn't enough. These weren't just villages anymore, they were complex, sprawling empires with thousands of citizens, vast trade networks, and intricate social hierarchies. How could a king ensure that a judge in a distant city was ruling the same way as a judge in the capital? How could a merchant from a foreign land be confident that a contract would be honored? The answer emerged from the very soil they walked on, clay. This was the dawn of written law, a seismic shift in human history where justice moved from the uncertainty of memory to the permanence of the written word. The driving force behind this revolution was a desperate need for consistency and control. Imagine an empire expanding its borders, assimilating new cultures and peoples. Without a standardized set of rules, chaos would reign. A legal decision in one town could be the complete opposite in another, leading to grievances, unrest, and a weakening of central authority. Writing laws down created a single, unchanging source of truth. It meant that for the first time, a law could exist independently of the person who declared it. It was no longer just the king's decree in that moment. It was the king's law for all time. This was about more than just punishment. It was about building a framework for a stable society. It established predictable consequences, which in turn fostered trust in commerce, protected property rights, and gave even the common person a reference point against the power of the elite. Written law became the bedrock of civilization itself, the glue that held these early empires together. While many rulers contributed to this legal revolution, one name has echoed through the millennia: Hammurabi, the king of Babylon. His famous law code, inscribed on a towering black stone stele, is one of the most complete and influential examples we have, but it's crucial to understand that Hammurabi was not the first. He stood on the shoulders of legal giants who came before him, like Ur-Nammu of Ur, whose laws were written centuries earlier. What made Hammurabi's code so enduring was its sheer comprehensiveness and its public nature. The stele was erected for all to see, a powerful statement that the law was not a secret tool of the powerful, but a known quantity that applied to everyone. It famously begins with a prologue establishing Hammurabi's divine right to rule and his duty to establish justice, merging the authority of the gods with the practicality of law. This set a powerful precedent, linking legal order to cosmic order, and the medium for this revolution, clay. In a world without paper, papyrus, or digital files, the Mesopotamians used what was abundant and durable. Scribes would take wet clay from the riverbanks, form it into a portable tablet, and use a sharpened reed stylus to press wedge-shaped marks into its surface, a writing system we call cuneiform. Once written, these tablets could be dried in the sun or baked hard in a kiln, transforming them into virtually indestructible records. A fired clay tablet could survive fires, floods, and millennia buried in the earth, which is exactly why we have so many of them today. This wasn't just a convenient choice, it was a brilliant one. The durability of clay meant that laws, contracts, and treaties could outlive the kings who commissioned them and the empires that created them. They became true time capsules, ensuring that the legal principles of these early civilizations would not be lost to time, but would instead wait patiently in the earth for future generations to discover and understand. While Hammurabi's name is famous, the true origin of written law begins centuries earlier in the powerful city of Ur, under the rule of a king named Ur-Nammu. His code isn't just older, it represents a fundamentally different approach to justice, discovered not on a grand monument but on humble, broken clay tablets in the ancient ruins of Nippur. This was a revolutionary find. For a long time, historians believed Hammurabi's code was the earliest. The discovery of Ur-Nammu's laws completely overturned that assumption, pushing back the timeline of codified law by around 300 years and forcing us to rewrite the history books on legal evolution. This was a code born from a specific moment of ambition and crisis. Ur-Nammu came to power in a time of political fragmentation. He had just freed Ur from the control of another city-state, and his first task was unifying a fractured land. He didn't just want to conquer, he needed to build a stable, prosperous, and above all, just empire that people would willingly be a part of. His law code was his primary tool for achieving this. In the prologue, which luckily survived on one of the tablets, he doesn't just boast of military victories. He states his divine mandate to establish equity in the land and to ensure that the orphan did not fall prey to the wealthy and that the widow did not fall prey to the powerful. This was public relations and statecraft of the highest order, a declaration that under his rule, fairness would be the new foundation of society. The most striking feature of Ur-Nammu's code is its overwhelming emphasis on restitution over retaliation. This is where it diverges most dramatically from the later and more famous eye for an eye principle. The laws are primarily concerned with making the victim whole again, not with inflicting symmetrical pain on the offender. For instance, if a man accidentally broke another man's foot with a weapon, the law did not call for his own foot to be broken. Instead, he was required to pay that injured man 10 silver shekels in compensation. This is a profound concept. It views crime not merely as an offense against the state or the gods, but as a personal injury that creates a debt between individuals. The state's role is to calculate that debt and enforce its payment, effectively healing the social tear caused by the crime. This system required a sophisticated understanding of value, a standardized currency, and a court system capable of adjudicating these claims. It suggests a society that was already highly complex and commercial, where silver could effectively restore balance. We can see this principle applied across a range of offenses. The code meticulously outlines fines for various bodily injuries. Causing a wound with a weapon might cost you 30 shekels, while hitting someone with a club could be a 5-shekel fine. These weren't arbitrary numbers, they represented a detailed tariff of harm, a price list for transgressions. This might seem cold to us today, but in its time it was remarkably progressive. It prevented blood feuds and cycles of violence that could tear communities apart. Even in cases of what we would consider serious crimes, the preference was for compensation. The law stating that if a man's slave woman, comparing herself to her mistress, insulted her, her mouth was to be scoured with 1 quart of salt, is often cited for its harshness. But we must read it in context. This was a society built on strict social hierarchies. The punishment was a brutal and public humiliation designed to reinforce that social boundary. Yet it stopped short of execution or mutilation, which were common elsewhere. It was about restoring the perceived social order, not ending a life. The code also provides a fascinating window into the social structure of ancient Sumer. It acknowledges and legally defines 3 distinct classes: free-born citizens, a dependent class sometimes called commoners, and slaves. The laws applied differently to each, confirming that equality under the law was a modern concept. However, the very act of writing these distinctions down provided a measure of protection for the lower classes. A master couldn't arbitrarily brutalize his slave. If he destroyed the slave's eye or tooth, he was required to set that slave free. This seems like a small mercy now, but it was a significant limitation on the absolute power of an owner. For historians, this layered legal reality is crucial. It challenges the simplistic myth that ancient law was universally barbaric. Instead, we see a society struggling with the same core issues we face today: how to balance power with mercy, how to define justice, and how to use rules to create a functioning, peaceful community. The Code of Ur-Nammu is a blueprint for that effort, a testament to the startlingly modern idea that law should be the mechanism that prevents the strong from devouring the weak. While Ernamu was establishing his vision of justice in the south, another powerful city-state to the north was crafting a legal code that was, in many ways, even more pragmatic and commercially minded. This was Eshnunna, a bustling, strategically located kingdom that acted as a crucial crossroads for trade routes connecting Mesopotamia with the wider ancient world. The Laws of Eshnana, discovered on 2 fragmented tablets in the modern-day site of Tel Abu Hamul, offer us a remarkable snapshot of a society obsessed with functionality, predictability, and the smooth operation of its economy. Unlike the grand proclamations of kings seeking divine favor, the Eshnunna laws read more like a detailed administrative manual, a straightforward list of if-then statements designed to keep the wheels of commerce turning and daily life running without friction. This was law not as philosophical ideal, but as essential civic infrastructure. The historical context of Eshnunna is key to understanding its legal priorities. Situated northeast of Babylon, It was a kingdom often caught between the competing ambitions of larger empires like Assyria and Elam. Its power and survival depended less on massive territorial conquest and more on its economic vitality. It was a hub. Merchants, traders, and goods from different cultures and regions flowed through its gates. This constant interaction created a pressing need for standardized rules that everyone, locals and foreigners alike, could understand and rely upon. A trader from far away needed to know exactly what the interest rate on a loan would be, what the penalty for a broken contract was, and how much he would be paid for his goods. Without this predictability, trust evaporates and trade grinds to a halt. The laws of Eshnunna were engineered to build that trust into the very fabric of the city, creating a stable environment where business could thrive. Perhaps the most fascinating and unique feature of this code is its official price list. The laws literally set fixed prices for essential goods and services, a stunningly early example of economic regulation. It decrees, for instance, that 1 gur of barley should cost 1 shekel of silver. 1 shekel of silver was also the established monthly wage for a hired laborer. The cost of oil, wool, fat, and even commodities like copper and salt are all meticulously listed. This wasn't just a suggestion, it was the law. By setting these prices, the rulers of Eshnunna were attempting to control inflation, prevent price gouging during shortages, and ensure that basic necessities remained affordable for the population. It was a tool for social stability as much as economic order, preventing the kind of popular unrest that could be sparked by famine or exploitation. The code's approach to personal injury and tort law continues this theme of pragmatic economic calculation. Like Ur-Nammu's code, it heavily favors monetary compensation over physical retaliation, but the fines are even more detailed and are often calculated based on the victim's social status. For example, if a man bit another man and severed his nose, the fine was 1 mina of silver, but if the victim was a slave, the fine was just 20 shekels. This distinction isn't about morality, it's a cold, hard reflection of economic reality. A slave was considered property, and the fine compensated the owner for the loss of his property's value. A free man's injury required compensation for his pain, suffering, and lost ability to work. This might seem brutally clinical to us, but it provided a clear, predictable formula for resolving disputes without violence. It took the emotional desire for revenge out of the equation and replaced it with a bill. Legal historians often point to the Laws of Eshnana as a crucial evolutionary link between the earlier Sumerian codes and the later, more comprehensive code of Hammurabi. You can see Hammurabi's scribes almost certainly had a copy of Eshnunna's laws on their desk when they were drafting their own code. Many of the same provisions appear, but they are expanded, refined, and placed within a more grandiose ideological framework. Where Eshnunna is concise and practical, Hammurabi is more thorough and declarative. This doesn't diminish Eshnunna's importance, it highlights it. It shows a legal tradition that was not created in isolation, but was part of a vibrant conversation happening across Mesopotamia. Kings and lawmakers were borrowing, adapting, and improving upon each other's ideas, creating a shared foundation of legal thought that would eventually influence civilizations for millennia to come. The Laws of Eshnana stand as a powerful testament to the fact that the greatest innovation of these early empires wasn't necessarily a specific law, but the revolutionary idea that law itself, written down, standardized, and applied, was the ultimate tool for building a complex and prosperous society. But these profound legal codes didn't just appear out of thin air. They were painstakingly brought into the world through an extraordinary fusion of artistry, engineering, and intellect, the craft of tablet making. This was a process that transformed the most mundane of materials, riverbank clay, into a near indestructible medium for human thought, a process so effective that it allowed the words of ancient scribes to speak directly to us across more than 4,000 years. It began with sourcing the perfect clay. Scribes weren't just grabbing the first handful of mud they found, they were connoisseurs of earth. They sought out specific, fine-grained clay deposits from the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, clay that was rich in silt and free of pebbles and organic matter that could crack or explode during drying. This clay was then meticulously purified. It would be soaked in water to create a slurry, then kneaded and wedged, much like a baker preparing dough, to remove any air bubbles. Trapped air was the enemy. It could cause a tablet to shatter during writing or, worse, during the firing process if it was destined for a kiln. The goal was a smooth, plastic, and perfectly homogeneous lump, ready to be shaped by skilled hands. The primary tool of the scribe was the stylus, a remarkably simple yet profoundly effective instrument. Typically, it was made from a dried reed, sharpened to a point, and then cut on an angle to create a distinctive triangular tip. Some finer styluses were crafted from bone or even metal for particularly important documents. The genius of the cuneiform writing system lay in this tool's interaction with the clay. The scribe didn't draw lines, they impressed wedges. By pressing the corner of the triangular tip into the soft clay, they created a deep, wide mark that tapered to a point, the fundamental wedge that gives cuneiform its name, from the Latin cuneus for wedge. A series of these impressions, arranged in different combinations and orientations, formed syllables, words, and numbers. This method was incredibly efficient and durable. Unlike ink on a surface which can fade or flake away, these impressions were physical alterations to the clay itself, making the writing an integral part of the object's structure. Once inscribed, the tablet's journey wasn't over. For everyday administrative notes, lists of rations, receipts for goods, or temporary records, a tablet might simply be left to dry in the hot Mesopotamian sun, becoming hard enough to last for a few months or years before eventually being recycled by being moistened and smoothed over. But for documents that needed to endure royal decrees, legal codes, property contracts, and religious texts, permanence was key. These tablets were often fired in kilns, a process that chemically altered the clay, turning it into ceramic and making it virtually impervious to the elements. Ironically, some of our best-preserved libraries of tablets owe their survival to catastrophe. The great royal archives of cities like Nineveh or Ebla were caught in enormous fires when the cities were sacked and burned. While these fires were devastating for the inhabitants, the intense heat baked the clay tablets stored within, firing them into ceramic and preserving them for archaeologists to find millennia later. A tragic silver lining that saved a vast trove of knowledge from turning back to dust. The physical form of a tablet often signaled its purpose and importance. Most common were the palm-sized, pillow-shaped tablets used for letters, contracts, and school exercises. Legal documents could be more elaborate, often encased in a clay envelope. A contract would be written on a tablet, then a thin layer of clay would be smoothed over it, bearing a duplicate or summary of the inner text and the seals of all the witnesses. This prevented tampering. To read the original contract, the outer envelope had to be broken, an act that was itself a formal legal procedure. Royal inscriptions and monumental texts were on a grander scale, sometimes taking the form of large cones, cylinders, or prisms that were deposited in the foundations of temples and palaces as time capsules for the gods or future kings. The language used could also vary. While Sumerian was the classic language of scholarship and law, as empires rose and fell, Akkadian, Hittite, and other languages were written in the adaptable cuneiform script, each requiring scribes to be not just writers but often multilingual translators as well. The survival of these tablets is a story of incredible luck and serendipity. In the arid, rain-starved climate of much of the Middle East, sun-dried tablets could survive for centuries buried in the ruins of mud-brick buildings. The very collapse of these structures often created a protective layer that shielded the fragile clay from erosion. When modern archaeologists began excavating mounds like Kyanjic ancient Nineveh in the 19th century, they were astounded to find entire rooms filled with shelves of tablets that had fallen from their original storage places but remained largely intact. The task of deciphering them was a monumental puzzle, but the durability of the baked clay meant that even broken fragments could be reassembled, their messages patiently waiting in the earth for someone who could once again understand their wedges and lines. This behind-the-scenes craft, this art of turning earth into eternity, was the unsung foundation of history itself, the crucial first step that allowed everything from a merchant's receipt to an emperor's law code to endure long after empires, cities, and languages had faded from memory. Behind every law code, every contract, and every royal decree was not just a king or a judge, but a highly trained specialist whose skill turned thought into permanent record, the scribe. These individuals were far more than mere secretaries. They were the intellectual engine of the empire, the legal experts, the accountants, and the administrators who made complex governance possible. In a world where literacy was a rare and powerful skill, scribes held immense influence. They were the guardians of legal knowledge, the only ones who could read the laws they wrote, interpret their nuances, and ensure they were applied correctly. A king could proclaim a law, but it was the scribe who gave it its enduring form, its precise wording, and its place in the vast and growing body of legal precedent. They were the human link between abstract royal authority and the concrete, day-to-day functioning of justice, acting as advisors in courts, drafters of treaties, and managers of the state's most vital asset, information. The path to becoming a scribe was long, rigorous, and typically reserved for the sons of the elite or the scribes themselves. Their training took place in institutions known as adabas, which translates literally to tablet houses. These were the world's first formal schools, and they were intense, disciplined environments. A student's day began early and was filled with relentless practice. The first and most fundamental challenge was mastering cuneiform itself. Imagine learning a writing system not with 26 letters, but with hundreds of distinct signs, each representing a syllable or a whole word, and each requiring a specific sequence of precise stylus impressions to form correctly. Students started by copying simple signs onto small, reusable clay tablets that could be smoothed over and used again. Discipline was strict. Stories and school texts from the time humorously complain about canings from the schoolmaster for poor penmanship or talking in class. Beyond mere writing, the curriculum covered mathematics, accounting, literature, and most importantly, law. Students would painstakingly copy existing law codes, legal phrases, and standardized contract forms, internalizing the language and principles of justice until it became second nature. This grueling process produced a class of individuals who were not just literate, but who thought in terms of legal frameworks and bureaucratic order. Upon graduation, a scribe's career options were vast and vital to the state. They could become court scribes, sitting alongside judges to record testimony, reference relevant laws from archived tablets, and draft the final verdict. They served as legal advisors to merchants, helping draft complex business contracts that outlined partnerships, loans, and transactions with clauses that protected both parties. Within the palace, high-ranking scribes acted as chief administrators, managing the flow of goods into and out of the royal storerooms, recording tax revenues, and overseeing the distribution of rations to workers and the army. Their role extended to diplomacy, Scribes were essential in drafting and translating treaties between empires, ensuring that the precise terms agreed upon by kings were accurately communicated and recorded for posterity. In every capacity, their work required not just literacy, but a deep understanding of law, economics, and human nature. They were the civil service, the legal corps, and the intellectual class, all rolled into one. This immense output of written material necessitated the invention of another crucial institution, the archive. Palaces, temples, and major governmental buildings all contained dedicated rooms or entire wings that functioned as record offices, the ancient equivalent of a national archives or a corporate filing system. These were not random storerooms, they were carefully organized libraries of clay tablets. Tablets were often stored on shelves, in baskets, or in clay jars, and they were frequently catalogued with labels, smaller tablets that acted as indexes, detailing the contents of a particular collection. The organization could be by date, by subject, or by case number. At the magnificent palace of Mari on the Euphrates River, archaeologists uncovered over 20,000 tablets in a single archive room, meticulously sorted. These tablets preserved everything from international correspondence and royal edicts to mundane inventory lists and legal disputes over land and inheritance. This system allowed a scribe or official to literally pull a case file from decades prior, setting a powerful precedent for a current legal decision. The very existence of these archives shows a sophisticated understanding that governance relied on memory, not human memory, but institutional memory preserved in clay. The discovery of these archives has been a goldmine for modern historians. The site of Nippur, a major Sumerian religious and cultural center, yielded tens of thousands of tablets from its temple and administrative buildings. These records reveal the breathtaking complexity of the ancient bureaucratic mind. We have tablets that document the exact number of sheep brought in for sacrifice, legal judgments over disputed irrigation water rights, and even records of a trial where a man was accused of stealing a hoe. This granular detail proves that no aspect of life was too small for the written record. It paints a picture of a society that was deeply legalistic and administrative, one that believed order could be maintained by meticulously documenting, categorizing, and referencing every transaction, dispute, and decree. The scribes were the masters of this system, the ones who kept the gears of civilization turning smoothly. They ensured that the law was not a vague concept but a living, breathing, and constantly referenced reality. Their work in these archives transformed law from a set of royal pronouncements into a continuous tradition, where past decisions informed present judgments, creating a stable and predictable legal environment that allowed these early empires to flourish for centuries. Yet for all their talk of justice and fairness, the legal codes of these ancient empires were never blind. They saw society not as a flat plane of equals, but as a steep pyramid with the king and nobles at the peak, a broad base of commoners in the middle, and slaves forming the foundation. The law did not ignore this structure, it meticulously codified it. To read these tablets is to see a world where your rights, your value, and even the price of your life were precisely calculated based on your social standing. A crime against a noble was not the same as a crime against a commoner, which was worlds apart from a crime against a slave. This wasn't a hidden bias, it was the explicit, written rule of the land. The law was the ultimate mirror, reflecting back the stark hierarchies that defined these early civilizations, reinforcing the power of the elite while offering a measure of protection but never true equality to those below. Nowhere is this more starkly illustrated than in the famous Code of Hammurabi. The law draws clear legal distinctions between three classes: the awilum, or free-born nobleman; the mushkenum, a dependent commoner who might work land owned by the palace or temple; and the wardem, a slave who was considered property. The principle of lex talionis, an eye for an eye, was not applied equally across these lines. If a nobleman struck another nobleman and destroyed his eye, the law demanded his own eye be put out. This was justice of exact reciprocity, but if that same nobleman destroyed the eye of a commoner, the punishment was not physical retribution. Instead, he was required to pay 1 mina of silver in compensation. The injury was settled with a financial transaction, a tariff on harm. The equation shifted again if the victim was a slave. If a nobleman destroyed the eye of another man's slave, he didn't lose his own eye or even pay a fine to the slave. He paid the slave's owner half the slave's value, compensating the owner for the damage to his property. The law viewed the slave not as a person who had been wronged, but as an asset that had been devalued. This legal stratification reveals the core values of these societies. Stability and order were paramount, but they were an order built on entrenched inequality. The system was designed to maintain the social fabric by preventing feuds among the powerful elite, while simultaneously protecting the economic interests of the propertied classes. A noble's body was inviolable because his status demanded it. A commoner's body had a clear monetary value that could restore balance. A slave's body was merely an extension of his master's wealth. This wasn't considered unjust in its time. It was simply the natural order of things made official and predictable. The law provided a clear, if brutal, framework for resolving conflicts between these unequal groups without resorting to perpetual violence. It managed conflict by pricing it. Yet, within this rigid framework, we also find surprising glimmers of protection for the vulnerable, nuances that complicate our modern view of these societies as purely oppressive. Even Hammurabi's code, for all its harsh hierarchies, contained laws that limited the absolute power of the strong. A nobleman could not arbitrarily abuse his slaves. If he struck a slave woman and caused her to miscarry, he was fined. If he destroyed his own slave's eye or tooth, that slave was granted their freedom, a small but significant check on cruelty. The code also provided specific protections for women, who were undoubtedly second-class citizens but not without legal agency. A woman could own property, run a business, and initiate divorce under certain conditions. If her husband abandoned her or was taken captive, she had the right to remarry without being accused of adultery, and she was entitled to the return of her dowry if the marriage ended. These provisions show that while society was patriarchal, the law recognized women as legal persons, not merely property. It sought to ensure a basic level of stability and fairness within the family unit, which was the bedrock of society. Historians see these ancient legal distinctions as the foundational layer of a struggle that continues to this day. The tension between law as a tool of power and law as a shield for the powerless. These codes established the precedent that law could be used to create order, but that the definition of order was deeply political. For millennia, legal systems across the globe would continue to enforce different standards based on class, race, and gender, using the authority of written law to justify inequality. The fight for true equality before the law, the idea that the same rules should apply to everyone, regardless of status, is a very modern concept, one that these ancient scribes and kings would have found radical and perhaps even destabilizing. Their goal was not equality, but a balanced, predictable hierarchy. They used the law to manage the inherent injustices of their world, sometimes mitigating them, often entrenching them, but always documenting them with breathtaking clarity on tablets of clay. This complex legacy challenges us to reflect on our own legal systems today and ask who they truly protect and what kind of order they are ultimately designed to create. While the majestic law codes of kings like Hammurabi and Ur-Nammu captured the grand principles of justice, it was in the bustling marketplaces and merchant quarters that the rubber of law truly met the road of daily life. Here, far from the royal palace, a different kind of law was at work. A pragmatic, detailed, and fiercely practical body of economic regulations designed to do one thing above all else: make commerce possible. In empires built on trade, trust was the most valuable currency, and it was a currency that could not exist without the solid foundation of written law. These ancient economies were not simple barter systems. They were complex networks of credit, loans, long-distance trade, and partnerships that stretched across hundreds of miles and involved people who might never meet face to face. For this intricate web to function, everyone needed to be playing by the same rules, and those rules needed to be so clear, so predictable, and so enforceable that a merchant in Assyria could confidently extend credit to a trader from Anatolia, knowing that the law had his back. The clay tablets that recorded these commercial laws are some of the most revealing, showing us a side of antiquity that is surprisingly modern in its sophistication and its unwavering focus on economic stability. The genius of these early economic lawmakers lay in their understanding of the fundamental levers that drive a market. They didn't just punish fraud after it happened, they built systems to prevent it from occurring in the first place. The most basic of these was the standardization of weights and measures. Imagine a world where every town might have its own definition of a shekel of silver or a gur of barley. The potential for confusion and cheating was endless, a constant friction that would have stifled trade. The laws of Eshnunna and later codes tackled this head-on. They didn't suggest a standard, they legally defined it. The law literally decreed that one sealer of fine oil should cost a specific amount, and that a hired laborer should be paid a specific wage per month. This wasn't price control in a modern socialist sense. It was a mechanism for creating a predictable economic environment. It allowed a trader from another city to know exactly what his goods were worth and what he could afford to buy, eliminating nasty surprises and building the confidence necessary for markets to flourish. This concept of a government-guaranteed standard is so fundamental that it remains the bedrock of all modern commerce, from the Bureau of Weights and Measures to the regulations governing every stock exchange on Earth. Perhaps even more astonishing was their sophisticated approach to credit and finance. These were not primitive cash economies. Silver was used, but much of the economic activity ran on credit. The laws established clear, maximum interest rates to prevent crippling debt and exploitation. For instance, the Code of Hammurabi set the interest rate on loans of silver at 20% and on loans of grain at 33%. This distinction is fascinating. It acknowledged that grain was a riskier loan, as it could spoil or harvests could fail, and thus commanded a higher price. These weren't arbitrary numbers. They were carefully calibrated to balance the lender's need for profit with the borrower's need to avoid being trapped in a cycle of debt slavery. The laws also detailed the formal requirements for a legally binding contract. A loan agreement or a sales contract had to be written down, witnessed by specific individuals, and sealed with the personal cylinder seals of the parties involved. These seals acted as unique, unforgeable signatures, and the clay tablet itself was the immutable record. We have countless examples of these contracts, some even encased in clay envelopes for added security, that outline partnerships where one merchant provided the silver and another undertook a risky journey, with profits split according to a pre-agreed formula. This was venture capitalism, ancient style, and it was all made possible by the security of written law. When disputes inevitably arose, the system was ready. The courts didn't guess, they referenced. Archaeologists have uncovered tablets that are essentially court transcripts from 4,000 years ago, detailing cases that feel remarkably familiar. One famous case from the ancient Assyrian merchant colony of Kanish in Anatolia involves a dispute over a consignment of tin and textiles. The plaintiff claimed his business partner had failed to deliver the promised profits. The court didn't rely on hearsay. It demanded the production of the original contract tablet. Scribes were called to read its terms aloud. Witnesses who had signed the tablet were questioned. Other tablets recording the sale of the goods were examined to verify the revenue. In the end, the judgment was based entirely on the written evidence. The defendant was found liable and ordered to compensate his partner, with the verdict itself being recorded on yet another tablet to create a legal precedent. This meticulous, evidence-based approach to commercial litigation was crucial. It sent a powerful message to everyone engaged in trade: the system works. Your agreements will be honored. If you are wronged, you will have recourse. This legal security is what encouraged merchants to invest, to innovate, and to extend their networks, fueling the economic growth that made these empires powerful. Historians and economists see in these clay tablets nothing less than the birth of the modern commercial world. The concepts of standardized currencies, regulated interest rates, binding contracts, and the reliance on written evidence in courts of law are all direct descendants of these ancient Mesopotamian innovations. They represent a monumental intellectual leap, the understanding that a healthy economy cannot be left to chance or brute force. It requires a framework of clear, transparent, and enforceable rules that create a level playing field and foster trust between strangers. This is the pragmatic, often overlooked side of ancient law. It wasn't always about dramatic eye for an eye justice. More often, it was about the quiet, meticulous work of ensuring that a farmer could sell his surplus grain, that a widow could loan out her small amount of silver with confidence, and that a caravan of donkeys could travel 1,000 miles with a cargo of goods, secured not by armed guards, but by the power of a written agreement on clay tablet. This legal infrastructure was the invisible engine of prosperity, the necessary precondition for the temples, palaces, and armies we usually associate with these great empires. It reveals a profound truth. Civilization is built not just on grand ideals, but on the practical certainty of a fair deal. When we think of ancient justice, our minds often jump to brutal images of harsh punishments, a world governed by the unforgiving principle of an eye for an eye. But the reality preserved on these clay tablets is far more complex, more sophisticated, and in many ways more humane than that popular myth. The legal minds of Mesopotamia were deeply preoccupied with one central question: how do you maintain order in a society without letting it descend into a cycle of endless vengeance? Their answer was a fascinating and nuanced legal system that sought not just to punish, but to deter, to compensate, and above all, to restore the balance that a crime had disrupted. This wasn't about blind rage, it was about calculated equilibrium. The principle of lex talionis, the law of retaliation, is indeed present most famously in Hammurabi's code. But it's crucial to understand its context. This brutal symmetry was not the default response to every crime. It was a specific solution to a specific problem, preventing blood feuds among the elite. In a society where honor was paramount, a nobleman who lost an eye in a fight might feel compelled to rally his entire family to take revenge, leading to a cycle of violence that could destabilize the entire community. By making the punishment exactly equal to the harm caused, the state inserted itself into the dispute. It said, "Your honor is satisfied, the debt is paid. The matter is closed." This was a way to contain violence, not to celebrate it. It was a legal circuit breaker designed to stop private vendettas before they could spiral out of control. For the powerful, whose status was tied to their physical wholeness and honor, this form of justice made a certain brutal sense. However, for the vast majority of offenses, especially those involving commoners, the preferred method was not retaliation but restitution. The legal codes are filled with meticulous price lists for harm. Break a man's bone, that will cost you 1 mina of silver. Knock out a tooth, that's 2 shekels. This system of monetary compensation was the true workhorse of ancient justice. It viewed crime not just as a sin against the gods or an offense against the king, but as a personal injury that created a debt between 2 parties. The goal was to make the victim whole again, to literally pay for their pain, suffering, and lost wages. This was a remarkably practical approach. A poor farmer who had his foot broken by a neighbor couldn't work his field. Taking the neighbor's foot in return didn't put food on the farmer's table, but 10 shekels of silver could buy that food and pay for help until he healed. The law was focused on repairing the tear in the social fabric, and cold, hard cash was often the most effective thread. What's even more astonishing is how these ancient courts considered factors like intent and context. They recognized the difference between premeditated malice and accidental harm. The tablets record cases where the outcome was tragic, but the intent was absent. For instance, if a man was struck and killed during a spontaneous brawl, the punishment might be a fine paid to the victim's family. But if that same man was ambushed and murdered in cold blood, the punishment could be execution. This distinction between murder and manslaughter is a cornerstone of modern law, and we find its clear origins in these 4,000-year-old texts. They understood that justice required looking into the heart of the offender, not just at the consequence of their action. The human stories bring this system to life in vivid detail. One tablet from the ancient city of Nippur records a court case involving a man named Ur-Nammu. He was accused of biting off the nose of another man during a fight. A seemingly straightforward case of assault, but the court didn't stop there. Witnesses were called. They testified that the victim had actually started the altercation and that Ur-Nammu had acted in self-defense. The judges considered this context carefully. In the end, Ur-Nammu was not subjected to the literal lex talionis of having his own nose removed. Instead, he was ordered to pay a compensation fee to his attacker for the injury. This case shows a legal system that was capable of flexibility, that could listen to evidence and adjust its ruling based on the circumstances. It was a system interested in the whole truth, not just a simple, brutal equation. This nuanced approach to crime and punishment reveals a society grappling with the same eternal questions we face today. How do we balance the need for retribution with the desire for rehabilitation? How do we ensure that justice is fair and not just a rubber stamp for power? Their answers, etched in clay, show a profound understanding that true justice is about more than just punishment. It's about restoration, deterrence, and above all, the preservation of a peaceful and orderly community. They used the law as a precise tool to calibrate the scales, understanding that sometimes those scales are balanced with silver and only very rarely with an eye. Beyond the bustling markets and the solemn courtrooms, the law found its way into the most intimate spaces of human existence, the home. The great legal codes of antiquity were not solely concerned with crimes and commerce. They were deeply invested in the very building blocks of society: marriage, children, and inheritance. These were the matters that determined bloodlines, secured property, and defined a person's place in the world from cradle to grave. The clay tablets that recorded these family laws are perhaps the most human of all these ancient documents. They don't just tell us about abstract principles of justice. They preserve the echoes of personal dramas, heartbreaks, and hopes, giving us an unprecedented window into the private lives of people who lived thousands of years ago. Through these intimate rules, we see how the state sought to bring order and predictability to the emotional and often messy realm of family, ensuring stability for both the individual and the empire as a whole. The Middle Assyrian laws, inscribed on tablets discovered in the ancient city of Ashur, provide one of the most detailed and sometimes startling blueprints for family life. These laws meticulously govern the behavior of women in particular, reflecting a society obsessed with controlling female sexuality to guarantee legitimate heirs and pure bloodlines. The penalties for adultery were brutally severe for women, often involving mutilation or even execution, while men faced far fewer consequences for similar transgressions. A married woman caught in an affair could be put to death by her husband, whereas a man's infidelity was largely his own business, provided it wasn't with another man's wife. This stark double standard wasn't about morality in a modern sense. It was about property and lineage. A woman's fidelity was the only absolute guarantee of paternity, and in a world where inheritance passed from father to son, certainty of paternity was everything. The law was the tool used to enforce this biological and economic imperative, using the threat of extreme violence to police the family unit and protect a man's investment in his future lineage. Yet, to view these ancient family laws solely through the lens of oppression is to miss their surprising complexity. Even within this rigid patriarchal framework, the law also functioned as a shield, offering women and children crucial protections that were legally enforceable. The institution of the dowry is a perfect example. When a woman married, her father provided a dowry, a transfer of wealth that could include silver, land, household goods, or even slaves. Crucially, this dowry did not become the absolute property of the husband. It remained legally tied to the woman. If her husband divorced her unjustly or died, the dowry was returned to her, providing her with a vital economic safety net that prevented destitution. This was not a mere custom. It was a legally binding contract recorded on tablet and witnessed by officials. In a society where women had limited opportunities to earn a living independently, this law ensured that a woman was not left completely powerless and vulnerable. It gave her a stake in the marriage and a form of financial security that the courts were obligated to uphold. The legal documents themselves bring these abstract rules to life in vivid, often poignant detail. We have marriage contracts that read like modern prenuptial agreements, outlining the exact value of the dowry and the penalties if either party breaks the contract. We have adoption tablets where a childless couple legally takes in a young child, with the contract specifying the child's right to inheritance, thus securing their future. One particularly moving record from the city of Nuzi details the adoption of a young boy named Ziggy. The tablet states that his adoptive parents shall treat him as a son. And if they do not treat Ziggy as a son, they shall pay a substantial fine of silver. This shows a legal understanding that adoption created real, enforceable bonds of kinship and responsibility. We also have heartbreaking divorce decrees. One tablet from Sippar records a woman named Iltoni divorcing her husband, a priest. The court not only grants the divorce but meticulously orders the return of her dowry in full, item by item, her bed, her chairs, her grinding stone, and 10 shekels of silver. This wasn't just a list of objects, it was the restitution of her economic independence and her chance to start again. The treatment of children under these laws further reveals a society that, while harsh by our standards, was not without a concept of welfare. Fathers held absolute power, yes, but the law also placed obligations on them. A father was legally required to support his children. If he abandoned them, he could be forced to pay for their upkeep. Laws also existed to protect the rights of orphans, ensuring their property was held in trust until they came of age and not squandered by greedy guardians. The Code of Hammurabi even contains a law stating that if a man disinherits his son without just cause, a judge can intervene and overturn the decision. This reveals a fascinating tension between the absolute authority of the patriarch and the state's interest in maintaining stable family structures and preventing arbitrary cruelty that could create social unrest. The law was the mediator, stepping in to ensure that the power of the father was exercised with a degree of responsibility. These intimate legal provisions show us that ancient law was not a distant, abstract force. It was woven into the fabric of daily existence, governing the deepest human relationships: love, trust, betrayal, and survival. It shaped identities, determining what it meant to be a wife, a husband, a son, or a daughter. It defined the very concept of family, legally binding people together in networks of obligation and care that were recognized and enforced by the state. The clay tablets that recorded a marriage contract or an adoption were not just administrative documents. They were the foundational charters of individual lives, the legal DNA of the family unit itself. They prove that for the people of these ancient empires, justice was not only about what happened in the public square, but about securing a future for one's children, protecting one's home, and finding a measure of dignity and security within the intricate and often unforgiving hierarchies of their world. In the minds of the ancient Mesopotamians, the law was never a purely human invention. It was not conceived in a palace meeting room or drafted by a committee of officials. Instead, it was believed to flow from a divine source, a sacred blueprint for how society should function that was handed down from the gods themselves. This profound connection between the spiritual and the legal worlds is one of the most defining features of these early civilizations. To separate religion from law would have been unthinkable. They were two sides of the same coin, a unified system that governed both moral conduct and legal obligation, ensuring that human justice was a reflection of cosmic order. This divine sanction was the ultimate source of a law's authority, the reason why a citizen was bound to obey not just out of fear of the king's soldiers, but out of reverence for the gods who ruled the universe. This concept is powerfully illustrated in the very opening lines of the most famous legal code of all. The Code of Hammurabi does not begin with a list of statutes. It begins with a prayer. The great king starts by listing the gods who have given him the right to rule, Anu and Enlil, the supreme deities. He proclaims that he was called by name by the god Marduk, the patron deity of Babylon, to bring about the rule of righteousness in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evildoers, so that the strong should not harm the weak. This is not just political propaganda, it is a theological statement. Hammurabi is not the author of the law, he is merely its divinely appointed steward and executor. The stone stele on which the code was inscribed shows the king standing before the sun god Shamash, the god of justice, who is handing him the symbols of royal authority. The message is unmistakable. These laws carry the weight of heaven. To break them is not just a crime against the state, it is a sin against the gods, an act of impiety that could bring divine retribution upon the entire community. This fusion gave the law an unshakable moral foundation that mere royal decree could never achieve. The institutions responsible for maintaining this sacred legal order were the temples and their priests. In these early empires, the temple was not just a place of worship, it was a vast economic, administrative, and judicial center. Priests were among the most educated and powerful figures in society, often serving as judges, legal advisors, and record keepers. Many of the earliest legal documents we have were written by temple scribes and stored in temple archives. Disputes over property, contracts, and even family matters were often brought before temple courts, where priests would render judgments they believed were in accordance with divine will. The temple's wealth, derived from vast landholdings and offerings, also meant it was a major party in legal contracts, leasing land to farmers and extending loans to citizens. In this capacity, the temple acted as both a bank and a court, its authority rooted in its sacred connection to the gods. The law was administered under the watchful eyes of the deities, ensuring that every transaction and every verdict was sanctified. This blending of the spiritual and legal was most dramatically visible in the practice of the ordeal, a trial method where the judgment was sought directly from the gods. In cases where evidence was lacking or the truth was a matter of one person's word against another's, the courts would resort to a supernatural verdict. The most common form was the river ordeal, dedicated to the river god. The accused would be thrown into the sacred river. If they drowned, the god had found them guilty. If they survived, the god had declared their innocence and they were set free. To our modern sensibilities, this seems like arbitrary cruelty, but for the people of the time, it was a perfectly rational and awe-inspiring process. They believed the river was a divine entity, a god capable of seeing into the human heart and rendering perfect judgment. Submitting to the ordeal was an act of faith. It was also a powerful psychological tool. The fear of divine punishment may have compelled many to confess their crimes before undergoing the test. Similarly, oaths sworn in the names of the gods were considered legally binding. To break an oath was to invite catastrophic divine wrath, making a sworn testimony the most powerful form of evidence one could offer in a trial. Scholars point out that this fusion of law and religion served a crucial sociological purpose. It created immense social cohesion. In a world without a strong police force or centralized bureaucracy, how did a king rule over diverse and far-flung populations? Divine authority was the answer. By linking the law to the unchanging, eternal will of the gods, it became something transcendent and absolute. It was not subject to the whims of a new ruler or the debates of a parliament. It was the fundamental, sacred order of things. This belief system encouraged voluntary compliance. People followed the law not only because they feared earthly punishment, but because they wanted to live in harmony with the cosmos, to be righteous in the eyes of the gods, and to ensure the continued favor and protection of the divine for their entire community. The law became a shared spiritual project, a collective effort to uphold Mot for the Egyptians or Mi for the Sumerians, concepts meaning cosmic truth, order, and justice. This spiritual foundation made the law resilient, allowing it to endure through dynastic changes and wars because its authority came from a source higher than any mortal king. This profound sense of a divinely mandated order did not stop at the border of a city-state or kingdom. If the gods ruled the entire world, then their laws of justice and righteousness should theoretically apply to interactions between empires as well. This spiritual framework provided the necessary common ground for the next great legal innovation, the creation of formal agreements between powerful rulers, the first international treaties, which were likewise sealed not just with promises but with sacred oaths to the gods. But the divine authority that underpinned law within an empire also provided the crucial common ground for something even more ambitious, the creation of the first rules between empires. In a world of clashing superpowers where war was a constant and costly reality, these ancient civilizations made a stunning leap in logic. They realized that the same principles of written, binding agreements that created order at home could be used to manage chaos abroad. The result was the birth of international law, a sophisticated diplomatic system where mighty kings who saw themselves as gods on earth willingly subjected themselves to a higher set of rules, all meticulously recorded on those same humble clay tablets. This was not just politics, it was a sacred covenant between nations, designed to replace the uncertainty of conflict with the predictability of peace. The most spectacular example of this ancient diplomacy is the Treaty of Kadesh, a peace accord signed around 1259 B.C. between the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II and the Hittite king Hattusili III. This wasn't a simple handshake agreement. The treaty was negotiated by teams of diplomats and scribes after decades of brutal warfare between the two empires, culminating in a massive but inconclusive battle at the city of Kadesh. Both sides were exhausted. The Hittites were facing threats on other fronts, and Egypt was bleeding treasure and soldiers in a war it couldn't clearly win. They reached a stalemate, and in that stalemate, they found the wisdom to choose parchment, or rather, clay over continued bloodshed. The treaty itself is a masterpiece of legal and political drafting. It survives in two versions, one in Egyptian hieroglyphs on temple walls at Karnak and the Ramesseum, and another, more complete version, written in Akkadian cuneiform on clay tablets found in the Hittite capital of Hattusa. This in itself is telling. It was a bilateral agreement with each power keeping its own official copy. The contents of the treaty are astonishingly modern. It doesn't just say, "We won't fight anymore." It lays out a detailed framework for a new relationship. It establishes clear boundaries between the two empires, ending the dispute over the strategically vital region of Syria. It includes a mutual defense pact, a clause stating that if either empire is attacked by a third party or faces an internal rebellion, the other will come to its aid with military force. This transforms them from enemies into allies against common threats. It also addresses the issue of political refugees, a thorny problem that still challenges nations today. The treaty obligates both kings to extradite each other's fugitives, but with a crucial caveat: they are not to be punished upon return. This shows a nuanced understanding that stability required managing the movement of disaffected people across borders without resorting to brutality that could reignite hostilities. This was a comprehensive peace designed to be self-enforcing by creating a shared interest in each other's stability and security. To ensure this agreement was unbreakable, the kings didn't just rely on good intentions. They made it sacred. The treaty is laden with religious oaths, invoking the entire pantheons of both Egypt and Hatti. Ramesses and Hattusili called upon their respective gods, 1,000 gods and goddesses of Hatti, and 1,000 gods and goddesses of Egypt, to bear witness to Their Chinese letter. But the gods weren't just witnesses, they were enforcers. The treaty concludes with a detailed list of divine curses for anyone who would dare break its terms. It calls upon the gods to destroy the lands and the family of the violator, to make his rivers run dry and his people perish. For a people who believed the divine was intimately involved in human affairs, these were not empty words. They were a terrifyingly real deterrent. To break the treaty was to risk bringing apocalyptic divine wrath down upon one's entire nation. This fusion of legal obligation and religious fear created a bond that was considered more powerful than any army. It elevated the agreement from a mere political document to a cosmic compact. Historians see the Treaty of Kadesh and others like it as the foundational stones of the entire concept of international relations. These were not vague declarations of friendship. They were precise, reciprocal, and legally structured documents that recognized the other party as a sovereign equal, a other great king deserving of respect and bound by the same rules. This idea of sovereignty, of a state's right to govern itself within its borders without external interference, is a cornerstone of modern international law, and we see its earliest expression in these Bronze Age treaties. The diplomatic practices they established, sending ambassadors, negotiating terms, creating identical copies in different languages, and depositing them in sacred archives, formed a protocol that would be refined over centuries, eventually influencing the Greeks, the Romans, and the diplomats of early modern Europe. These ancient empires understood that true power wasn't just the ability to conquer, but the ability to create a stable world order where commerce could flourish and people could thrive. They discovered that sometimes the most powerful weapon was not a chariot or a spear, but a carefully written promise on a tablet of clay, guaranteed by the gods themselves. For centuries, the laws of these great empires lay silent and forgotten, buried beneath the very dust from which their clay tablets were formed. Their rediscovery is not just a chapter in the history of archaeology. It is a series of thrilling adventures, a global detective story filled with intrepid explorers, impossible puzzles, and breathtaking moments of revelation that literally rewrote human history. The journey to bring these ancient laws back into the light began not in a university library, but in the harsh, sun-scorched landscapes of the Middle East, where great mounds or tells rose from the plains, the visible tombs of long-dead cities, hiding their secrets under layers of earth and time. The early pioneers were often a unique blend of scholar and adventurer, funded by European museums in a great race to uncover the physical proof of civilizations that, until then, existed only in Bible stories and classical myths. They arrived with little more than shovels, local labor, and boundless determination. Their methods were crude by today's standards, often focused more on retrieving impressive sculptures and palace wall reliefs than on the fragile, unassuming clay tablets that frequently crumbled in their hands. Yet, despite this, they made finds of staggering importance. In the 1840s, a young British diplomat and adventurer named Austin Henry Layard began digging into the Great Mound of Khanjik near Mosul in modern-day Iraq. He was searching for the biblical city of Nineveh, and what he found would stun the world: the magnificent palace of the Assyrian king Sennacherib. But the true treasure trove was unearthed by his assistant, Hormuzd Rassam, a few years later. In the ruins of the palace of King Ashurbanipal, Rassam discovered room after room that had been filled with clay tablets when the palace was sacked and burned in 612 B.C. The intense fire had the unintended effect of baking and preserving this entire royal library. Layard and Rassam shipped over 100,000 of these fragments back to the British Museum, utterly unaware that they contained the entire intellectual and administrative output of an empire, including copies of the very law codes that governed it. Other monumental discoveries followed, each adding another voice to the ancient chorus. In the 1970s, an Italian team led by Paolo Mattii was excavating a massive tell in northern Syria known as Tel Marduk. They were uncovering a magnificent, unknown city from the 3rd millennium BC called Ebla. The discovery was already significant, but then they found it, the palace archives. Inside, they uncovered more than 17,000 complete tablets and many thousands more fragments. These weren't just administrative lists. They contained royal decrees, diplomatic correspondence, legal judgments, and sophisticated literary texts. The Ebla tablets revealed a previously unknown kingdom of immense wealth and sophistication, with a legal and economic system that was stunningly complex. They proved that the practice of writing law on clay was not confined to the well-known empires of Babylonia and Assyria, but was a widespread practice across the region, each city-state adding its own unique legal voice to the conversation. But unearthing these tablets was only half the battle. The greatest challenge lay in understanding them. For decades, these piles of baked clay were complete mysteries. The curious wedge-shaped script, which scholars named cuneiform from the Latin word for wedge, was an enigma. How could anyone crack a code for a language that had been dead for over 2,000 years? The breakthrough came from a monumental cliff face in western Iran, at a place called Behistun. Here, the Persian king Darius the Great had commissioned a massive relief and inscription around 500 B.C. To celebrate his victories. The genius of the inscription was that it was written in 3 different languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian Akkadian. It was the Rosetta Stone of cuneiform. A British Army officer named Henry Rawlinson performed a feat of incredible daring, scaling the treacherous cliff face over and over again to carefully make paper casts of the entire inscription. Armed with this trilingual key, a team of brilliant linguists across Europe, including Edward Hincks and Jules Oppert, began the painstaking work of decipherment. They started with the known Old Persian and slowly, agonizingly unlocked the others. The moment the Akkadian section was cracked, the door to Mesopotamia swung wide open. Suddenly, the piles of tablets in museum basements began to speak. They weren't just strange artifacts, they were letters, contracts, epic poems, and laws. The decoded Behistun inscription gave them the voice they had lost for millennia. This collaborative effort between daring excavators and meticulous linguists continues to this day. Modern archaeologists no longer dig with just shovels. They use satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and 3-dimensional scanning to locate and document their finds with microscopic precision. They work alongside conservators who have developed ingenious methods to gently clean, stabilize, and sometimes even digitally unfold tablets that are still sealed in their clay envelopes without ever breaking them. And the discoveries haven't stopped. New archives are still being found from ancient Kanish in Turkey, which revealed a detailed merchant colony's records, to recently unearthed tablets in Iraq that continue to add new paragraphs to the story of ancient law. Each new find is a testament to human curiosity, a relentless drive to reach across the centuries, to listen to the whispers from the dust, and to recover the wisdom of those who first dared to write the rules of civilization. Walking into the archive of a major Mesopotamian city would have been an experience not unlike walking into the United Nations today. The shelves wouldn't hold tablets in a single, uniform language. Instead, you'd find a symphony of scripts and tongues, the elegant, complex wedges of Sumerian resting beside the more cursive Akkadian, the distinctive signs of Hittite, and even the unique script of Elamite from distant Iran. This incredible linguistic diversity wasn't a sign of confusion. It was the hallmark of a sophisticated, cosmopolitan empire. The law, in its quest for order, had to speak many languages. It had to be understood by a Hittite merchant in a Babylonian court, an Elamite prisoner of war, and a Sumerian priest whose ancient language was now primarily liturgical. The clay tablets themselves became polyglot ambassadors, proving that the first great empires weren't monolithic cultural blocks, but vibrant, multi-ethnic melting pots where legal clarity required a dizzying mastery of translation and adaptation. The key to this linguistic miracle was the incredible flexibility of the cuneiform script itself. It was a system of writing, not a language. Originally invented by the Sumerians to record their own tongue, it was quickly recognized by neighboring cultures as a revolutionary technology too powerful to ignore. The Akkadians, a Semitic-speaking people, were the first to adopt it, but they faced a problem. Sumerian was a language isolate with no relation to their own. Their solution was brilliant. They used the cuneiform signs in 2 distinct ways, as logograms and as phonograms. A sign like letter 12450, which originally meant God in Sumerian pronounced dingir, could still be used to represent the concept of a god when writing Akkadian, but it would be read as the Akkadian word ilu. Alternatively, that same sign could be stripped of its meaning and used purely for its sound value, the syllable di or il, to spell out Akkadian words that had nothing to do with divinity. This dual system allowed scribes to write anything they could say, making cuneiform an adaptable vehicle for languages as different as Semitic Akkadian, Indo-European Hittite, and isolated Elamite. It was the software, and each culture installed its own linguistic operating system. For legal texts, this adaptability was channeled into a powerful force for standardization and authority. While a private letter might be written in a more casual, phonetic style, a law code or a royal decree demanded absolute clarity and left no room for misinterpretation. To achieve this, legal scribes often relied heavily on logogram signs that represented whole words. This created a formal, almost ceremonial legal shorthand that could be read and understood by educated scribes across different language groups. A scribe from Assyria and a scribe from Hattusa might pronounce the word for king completely differently, Sharam in Akkadian versus Hushuz in Hittite, but they would both recognize and understand the same cuneiform logogram letter 12217. This created a universal legal vocabulary, a visual lingua franca that transcended spoken language barriers and gave legal documents an imposing, unchanging authority. The law looked the same and meant the same from one end of the empire to the other. This doesn't mean translation wasn't necessary. In the day-to-day operation of the courts, especially in border regions or bustling trade centers, the spoken word was vital. This is where the scribe's role expanded from mere writer to legal interpreter. We have records of cases involving parties who spoke different languages. In these instances, court scribes, likely trained in multiple languages, would have acted as translators, ensuring that testimony was accurately understood by all parties and that the judge's verdict was clearly communicated. Their work was essential for maintaining trust in the system. A merchant from Anatolia needed to be confident that his plea was being heard correctly in a Babylonian court. The presence of these multilingual legal experts ensured that justice wasn't lost in translation, that the empire's promise of fair and orderly rule was accessible to all its diverse subjects, not just the linguistic majority. Some of the most fascinating discoveries that prove this point are bilingual dictionaries and legal phrasebooks, the ancient equivalents of a lawyer's pocket guide to international law. At the Hittite capital of Hattusa, archaeologists found tablets that are essentially legal glossaries. They list Sumerian and Akkadian legal terms side by side with their Hittite equivalents. For a Hittite scribe training to deal with international treaties or correspondence with Babylonian kings, this tablet was an essential reference tool. It allowed him to ensure that the precise, legally binding terminology of a more established legal tradition was correctly rendered into his own language. We even have exercise tablets from scribble schools where students practiced translating standard legal clauses from one language to another. This proves that multilingualism wasn't an accident. It was a professionally cultivated skill, a core part of the training required to administer a vast and diverse empire. These glossaries weren't just word lists, they were instruments of imperial cohesion, ensuring that a contract written in Akkadian in Babylon would have the exact same legal force and meaning when read by a Hittite official hundreds of miles away. This linguistic richness ultimately reveals a profound truth about these early empires. Their strength lay not in imposing a single, monolithic culture, but in their ability to manage diversity. They understood that to govern vast territories filled with different peoples, they had to incorporate them, to make them feel seen and heard by the very system that ruled them. By allowing legal proceedings to be conducted in multiple languages and by training a cadre of scribes who could bridge these cultural divides, they built a flexible and resilient system of governance. The law became a unifying force precisely because it could accommodate difference. It provided a common framework of justice that respected linguistic and cultural boundaries, proving that even 4,000 years ago, the most effective rule of law was one that could speak in more than one voice. But these meticulously written laws were not meant to gather dust on a shelf in some royal archive. They were living documents designed to be used, debated, and applied in the noisy, chaotic reality of everyday life. The true test of any legal system is not the grandeur of its proclamations, but the grit of its enforcement, how it functions when two neighbors are arguing over a boundary wall, a merchant accuses his partner of theft, or a widow fights for her inheritance. This is where the ancient Mesopotamians truly proved their legal genius, building a multi-layered, surprisingly accessible court system that brought the written word on clay tablets into the messy and human world of conflict resolution. It was a system that valued practical solutions as much as abstract principles, showing a flexibility that would surprise many people today. The structure of this judicial system was both hierarchical and deeply community-based. At the most local level, in a village or a city neighborhood, justice often began with a council of elders. These were respected senior members of the community who knew the families involved, understood the local customs, and could mediate disputes quickly without the need for formal proceedings. They operated like a combination of a modern small claims court and a neighborhood mediation board, relying on their wisdom and social standing to broker compromises and restore harmony. If a dispute couldn't be resolved locally, or if it involved more serious charges or valuable property, it would move up to a formal court presided over by professional judges, often accompanied by a panel of merchants or other officials. These judges were not necessarily legal scholars in the modern sense. They were high-ranking state administrators, mayors, or temple officials whose authority derived from their royal appointment. At the very top of this pyramid was the king himself, who was considered the supreme judge and the court of final appeal. Citizens could, and did, petition the king directly for justice, and some of the most fascinating letters we have are these appeals, begging the king to intervene in a corrupt local judgment or a powerful noble's abuse of power. Inside these courts, the written law codes served as crucial reference points, but they were not the only source of law. The judges also drew heavily on what we would call customary law, the unwritten traditions and commonly accepted practices of the community, and on their own sense of equity and fairness. The court records preserved on tablets reveal this pragmatic blend beautifully. In a case from the ancient city of Lhasa, we read about a dispute over a loan. The borrower admitted the debt but pleaded for more time to pay, citing a poor harvest. The written law might have strictly demanded immediate payment in full, potentially forcing the borrower and his family into debt slavery. But the court record shows the judges considered the man's circumstances. They examined other evidence, heard testimony about the harvest's failure, and ultimately granted him an extension. The goal was not rigid adherence to the code, but a resolution that prevented a minor financial dispute from spiraling into a social catastrophe. The law provided the framework, but human judgment applied it with compassion and a view to the broader social good. The court procedures themselves were remarkably sophisticated and would feel familiar to any modern lawyer. A case began with a plaintiff bringing a complaint, followed by the defendant's response. Both parties were required to provide evidence which could include physical objects, written contracts, or, most commonly, the testimony of witnesses. The act of bringing witnesses was a formal and crucial part of the process. Their names were meticulously recorded on the final verdict tablet, legally binding them to the truth of their statement and making them liable if perjury was later discovered. In cases without clear evidence, the court might resort to administering oaths to the gods. A defendant might be required to swear a solemn oath of innocence before the symbol of a deity. The belief that breaking such an oath would bring devastating divine punishment was so powerful that it was considered a valid form of evidence. For the ancient mind, a man might lie to a judge, but he would not dare lie to Shamash, the god of justice. Legal historians point out that this system represents a fascinating middle ground between two modern legal theories. It wasn't a purely positivist system, where the written law is the only source of right and wrong. Nor was it a purely natural law system based solely on universal principles of justice. It was a blend. The written code set the standards and the tariffs for penalties, providing predictability. But the judges used their discretion to weigh the evidence, consider intent, and apply customary practices to achieve what they saw as a just outcome in that specific situation. This practice-oriented approach meant the law could adapt. As new situations arose that weren't covered by the old code's new types of contracts, new technologies, new social problems, the judges could create new precedent through their rulings, and these rulings could then inform future scribes who might update the official codes. The law was a living, evolving entity, growing and changing with the society it served, all documented on the endless flow of clay tablets from the courts. This examination of enforcement shatters the simplistic image of ancient justice as a monolithic and brutal machine. Instead, we see a complex, nuanced, and often surprisingly humane system designed above all else to resolve conflict and maintain social stability. It was a system that trusted its judges with significant discretion, that valued witness testimony and written evidence, and that understood the law's ultimate purpose was to serve people, not to be served by them. This pragmatic spirit would be essential as these societies tackled one of the most fundamental and perpetual sources of human conflict, the ownership of property. In the world's first great agricultural empires, land was far more than just dirt beneath your feet. It was the ultimate source of wealth, status, and survival. It was the engine of the entire economy, and because it was so immensely valuable, it became the single greatest source of conflict. Who owned which plot? Who had the right to use the water that flowed past it? What happened when a father died? How was his land divided among his sons? Without clear answers to these questions, society would have descended into a perpetual state of feud and chaos. The revolutionary solution, once again, was to write it all down. The ancient Mesopotamians used their clay tablets to create the world's first comprehensive system of property law, a complex web of rules governing ownership, inheritance, and tenancy that provided the stability necessary for civilization to flourish. These weren't just administrative records, they were the legal DNA that mapped out who controlled the most precious resource on Earth. The Laws of Ishtar, a code from the city of Isin that predates Hammurabi by over a century, provide a stunning window into how meticulously these issues were regulated. This code dedicates significant attention to the problems of inheritance, recognizing that the smooth transfer of property from one generation to the next was the bedrock of long-term family stability and, by extension, social order. The laws stipulate the default shares for sons from a first marriage versus those from a second, and they even address the rights of a father who chooses to formally disinherit a son, requiring a public legal process to make it valid. This prevented arbitrary banishment and protected the rights of heirs, but perhaps the most critical provisions concerned what happened when there were no direct male heirs. The code outlines a precise order of succession, passing the property to brothers, uncles, or other male relatives to ensure that the land stayed within the family and did not fall out of cultivation or become a subject of dispute. This careful legal architecture was designed to prevent the kind of inter-family warfare that could erupt over a contested inheritance. Beyond the family, the law also had to manage the relationships between neighbors, and nothing was more contentious than water. In the arid landscape of Mesopotamia, a field without water was worthless. Irrigation was a matter of life and death. The laws therefore treated water not as a free-for-all resource, but as a legally apportioned commodity. The Code of Hammurabi contains specific clauses that make a landowner responsible for the maintenance of his section of the communal irrigation ditch. If he was negligent and allowed the ditch to silt up or break, causing water to flood his neighbor's field, he was legally obligated to compensate that neighbor for every bushel of grain lost. This was a brilliant piece of social engineering. It made every individual responsible for the health of the shared infrastructure, using the threat of financial penalty to ensure cooperation for the common good. The law effectively managed a public resource through private obligation. The day-to-day application of these property laws is where they truly come to life, preserved in the countless sales contracts, lease agreements, and court records found by archaeologists. A typical land sale tablet is a masterpiece of legal thoroughness. It doesn't just state that person A sold a field to person B. It describes the field in pinpoint detail, its size, its location relative to well-known landmarks like the canal of the god Shamash or the field of the son of so and so, and the names of its adjacent neighbors on all four sides. This precise description was crucial for preventing future boundary disputes. The tablet then lists the purchase price, the names of the witnesses who were present at the transaction, and the seals of both parties. Often, the seller would include a clause guaranteeing that no other relative would later emerge to contest the sale, a promise that protected the buyer from future legal challenges. This wasn't a simple handshake deal. It was a legally airtight transfer of ownership designed to be unchallengeable in any court. When disputes did arise, as they inevitably would, the courts relied heavily on this written evidence. A fascinating case from the ancient city of Nippur involves two brothers arguing over their inheritance from their father. One brother claimed the other had received more than his fair share of the family date palm grove. The case didn't hinge on emotional testimony or hearsay. The presiding judge demanded the production of the original inheritance document, the tablet that had been drawn up and sealed at the time of their father's death. Scribes were called to read the tablet aloud in court. The terms were clear, and the brother's claim was found to be without merit. The verdict was recorded on a new tablet, which concluded that the original division was just and must stand. This demonstrates a profound legal principle. The written record, created at the time of the event and witnessed by multiple parties, held supreme authority. It was the closest thing they had to objective truth. The influence of these early Mesopotamian property laws echoes powerfully through history, all the way to our modern systems. Roman law, which forms the direct foundation for most of the world's legal systems today, adopted and refined these same concepts. The Roman emphasis on clear title, surveyed boundaries, written contracts, and witness testimony is a direct intellectual descendant of the practices pioneered in Sumer and Babylon. The very idea of a deed to your house, a piece of paper that definitively proves your ownership and describes your property's exact limits, is a concept that was first pressed into wet clay over 4,000 years ago. Legal historians see this as one of Mesopotamia's greatest and most enduring contributions to human civilization. The concept that land ownership isn't just a matter of physical possession or force, but a right that can be defined, documented, defended in court, and passed down through generations. This created the stability that allowed for long-term investment in land, encouraging farmers to plant orchards that would take years to mature and builders to construct permanent homes, secure in the knowledge that their claim to that property was recognized and protected by the full force of the law. It transformed land from a temporary resource to be fought over into a lasting legacy to be nurtured. The vast temples and towering ziggurats of Mesopotamia did not build themselves. The sprawling irrigation canals that turned desert into farmland required constant, backbreaking maintenance. This immense economic engine ran on two fundamental fuels: the regulated labor of free citizens and the forced labor of slaves. The legal codes of the time, far from ignoring this reality, dove into its complexities with stunning detail, creating a sophisticated body of labor law that sought to balance the empire's insatiable need for work with a surprising and often overlooked concern for basic fairness and human dignity. These regulations, pressed into clay, show us a society grappling with the moral and economic contradictions of its own workforce, creating a system that was brutally hierarchical, yet occasionally offered a glimmer of hope and a path to a better life. For free laborers, the law provided a framework of remarkable predictability. The codes of Eshnunna and Hammurabi didn't leave wages to the chaotic whims of the market. They established fixed rates, creating a stable economic environment for both worker and employer. The law might decree that a hired laborer should be paid 1 shekel of silver for a month's work, while a skilled carpenter or a leather worker could command 5 or 6 shekels for the same period. This recognition of skilled versus unskilled labor is a concept that feels instantly modern. These weren't just suggestions, they were legally enforceable standards. If a wealthy landowner tried to underpay a harvester during the busy season, that worker could take him to court, and the judge would reference the official code to ensure he received his fair wage. This system protected vulnerable workers from exploitation while also giving employers certainty about their costs, preventing labor disputes from disrupting the critical harvests and construction projects that the empire depended on for its survival. But the most complex and morally challenging area of ancient labor law concerned slavery. To our modern eyes, the very concept of a slave's rights seems like a contradiction in terms. Yet the Mesopotamian legal mind, in its relentless drive for order and functionality, saw even slaves as legal entities, not just property. The law drew a crucial distinction between a slave and a free person, but it did not place the slave entirely outside its protection. The Code of Hammurabi is particularly revealing on this point. It states clearly that if a slave owner strikes his own slave and causes the slave's death, it is not considered murder. However, and this is the critical nuance, if the slave dies after a day or two, the owner is not held liable, as it could be argued the slave died from the pre-existing condition. This cold, clinical analysis shows the law viewing the slave primarily as a valuable asset, but the same code also limits the owner's power. If the owner destroys the slave's eye or knocks out a tooth, the law doesn't just shrug. It mandates that the slave must be set free as compensation for the injury. This is a profound legal concept. It established that there was a line, that excessive brutality against one's own property was not just morally wrong but legally actionable, with freedom being the remedy. The most extraordinary innovation, however, was the legal mechanism for manumission, the process by which a slave could earn or purchase their freedom. This wasn't a rare act of mercy, it was a formal, contract-based system integrated into the economy. We have numerous tablets that record these agreements. A common arrangement was called an antikrisis contract. A slave could enter into a formal agreement with their master. The master would provide the slave with capital, perhaps a small plot of land, a donkey, or raw materials for a craft. The slave would then work that capital, keeping a portion of the profits while giving the rest to the master. After a set number of years, or once a specific sum had been paid, the contract would be fulfilled and the slave would be granted their freedom. These contracts were drawn up by scribes, witnessed by officials, and stored as legal documents. They transformed the master-slave relationship into a temporary business partnership with a clear exit clause, offering a legally guaranteed pathway out of bondage. The day-to-day reality of these laws comes to life in the court records. One tablet from the city of Sippar tells the story of a slave named Bel-User. He took his master to court, arguing that he had fulfilled the terms of his manumission contract but was still being held in bondage. The court didn't dismiss his case out of hand. The judges heard testimony, examined the original contract tablet, and ruled in Bel-User's favor, ordering his immediate release. This case is staggering. It shows a legal system that granted a slave not just passive protections but active legal agency. A slave could sue his master and win based on the violation of a written agreement. This reveals a society that believed the sanctity of a contract was more powerful than the social hierarchy of the day. When we compare these ancient practices to modern labor issues, the parallels are both haunting and illuminating. The fixed wage laws echo our own minimum wage debates, the eternal tension between the cost of labor and the right to a living income. The plight of indebted workers in antiquity, who could be forced into servitude to pay off loans, finds a disturbing modern counterpart in the debt bondage and forced labor that still traps millions of people around the world today. The anticrisis contracts are a primitive ancestor of profit-sharing schemes and employee stock ownership plans, modern tools designed to give workers a stake in the success of an enterprise. These ancient systems show us that the core challenges of labor balancing power, ensuring fair compensation, and preventing exploitation are not new. They are enduring human problems that every society must confront. This exploration of ancient labor law forces us to abandon simplistic judgments. It was not a system of unrelenting brutality, nor was it a beacon of modern liberal values. It was a complex, contradictory, and pragmatic attempt to manage a workforce that was essential yet marginalized, to extract economic value from human beings while acknowledging, however minimally, their inherent dignity and their potential for something more. The clay tablets that recorded a slave's purchase price and the tablet that recorded his manumission contract represent the two poles of this ancient reality. The crushing weight of ownership and the hard-won, legally enforced dream of freedom. They remind us that the law has always been the primary battleground where economics meets ethics, where the needs of the powerful are weighed against the rights of those who do the work. We often imagine ancient cities as chaotic, filthy places, a stark contrast to our own modern world with its regulated sanitation and public health infrastructure. But the clay tablets force us to rethink that assumption. These early empires, for all their grandeur, were incredibly vulnerable. Dense populations living in close quarters, shared water sources, and the constant threat of plague created a ticking time bomb. The rulers and lawmakers knew this. Their survival depended on maintaining a healthy, functioning population to man the armies, work the fields, and pay the taxes. And so they did something astonishing. They wrote public health and safety directly into the legal code. This wasn't a matter of suggestion. It was a matter of law, with real penalties for those who threatened the well-being of the community. This represents a monumental leap in thinking the idea that the government had a direct responsibility to protect its citizens from invisible threats like disease and from the dangers of their own crowded existence. The Hittite laws, carved into clay tablets in what is now Turkey, provide some of the most explicit examples of this early public health consciousness. One fascinating law deals with the very modern-sounding problem of pollution. It states that if a man deliberately pollutes a communal well or a source of drinking water, he is subject to a significant fine. The law doesn't specify what constitutes pollution, whether it's throwing refuse into the water or allowing animal waste to seep in, but the principle is clear. Contaminating a shared resource was a serious offense against the entire community. This demonstrates an understanding of the link between clean water and public health that we still struggle to enforce in parts of the world today. Another Hittite law addresses the danger of neglected buildings. If a building collapsed and killed the owner, that was considered a private tragedy. But if it collapsed and killed a tenant, the building's owner was held legally responsible. This created a powerful financial incentive for landlords to maintain their properties in safe condition, protecting renters from unsafe housing and preventing structural collapses that could injure bystanders or block crucial streets. Enforcement of these regulations was a blend of state power and community obligation. Fines were the most common penalty, a practical tool that both punished the offender and added to the royal coffers. But some issues required collective action. Maintaining the complex network of irrigation canals that fed the fields and provided drinking water was everyone's business. The Code of Hammurabi includes clauses that made landowners responsible for the upkeep of the canal adjacent to their property. If a man was negligent and his section of the ditch collapsed, flooding his neighbor's field, he was required to compensate his neighbor for every grain of barley lost. This wasn't just about property damage. A breached canal could deprive an entire district of water, leading to famine and social unrest. The law effectively made every citizen a stakeholder in the public works that kept society alive, using financial liability to ensure communal cooperation. The driving force behind these large-scale public health initiatives was almost always the palace or the temple. These were the only institutions with the resources, authority, and organizational capacity to undertake massive projects. Tablets record the orders of kings to dredge major canals, to build new aqueducts, and to construct protective walls against floods. Temples, as major landowners and economic hubs, often managed the local distribution of water and the storage of emergency grain supplies for times of famine. They also played a role in what we might recognize as early quarantine measures. Texts describe how during outbreaks of contagious disease, often blamed on divine anger, people might be isolated and travel in and out of affected cities could be restricted. While based on a religious understanding of illness, these practices had the very practical effect of limiting the spread of infection. The line between a religious ritual for purification and a public health sanitation order was often blurry, but the outcome was the same, an organized effort to safeguard the population. Historians see in these ancient regulations the very origins of urban planning and modern civic governance. The famous plumbing and aqueducts of the Romans did not emerge from a vacuum. They were the culmination of millennia of experimentation and legal precedent set by these Mesopotamian and Anatolian empires. The core idea that a government has a duty to ensure clean water, safe buildings, and hygienic conditions for its citizens is a direct inheritance from these early legal codes. It represents a shift from reactive punishment to proactive prevention. The law was being used not just to adjudicate disputes after the fact, but to engineer a safer, healthier environment from the start. This proactive side of ancient law is perhaps its most enduring legacy, a testament to the foresight of rulers who understood that the greatest strength of an empire was not just its army, but the health and well-being of the people it was built to serve. But the law's quest for order didn't stop at managing people and property. It also stretched its arms to embrace the future, actively shaping the technological landscape that would define these empires for centuries. We often think of innovation as a force that disrupts and outpaces regulation, but in the ancient world, the relationship was far more symbiotic. Lawmakers recognized that new technologies, from the plow to the forge, were the engines of prosperity and power, but they also understood that these tools came with risks that needed to be managed. The result was a fascinating body of technology law, a set of rules designed not to stifle creativity, but to channel it responsibly, to set standards that built trust, and to protect the ingenious minds behind the inventions. This reveals a side of these civilizations that was profoundly forward-thinking, using the clay tablet not just to record the past, but to legislate the future. Consider the monumental challenge of water management in a land between two great rivers. Irrigation was the lifeblood of Mesopotamia, and the technology behind it was constantly evolving. The law didn't ignore this, it actively regulated it. The Code of Hammurabi contains specific clauses governing the use and maintenance of the shadaf, a sophisticated counterweighted irrigation tool that allowed farmers to lift water from canals to higher fields. The law made a landowner legally responsible for the upkeep of the shadaf on his property. If he was negligent and his device broke, causing a water shortage for his downstream neighbors, he was liable for the lost crops. This wasn't just a rule about property damage, it was a regulation of a specific technology designed to ensure its safe and effective operation for the benefit of the entire community. It created a legal incentive for farmers to maintain their equipment properly, understanding that one person's technological failure could have cascading effects on the regional food supply. This regulatory mindset extended to the earliest forms of mass production, particularly in metallurgy. The production of bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, was a highly complex and valuable industry. The quality of the bronze used in weapons, tools, and ritual objects was a matter of state security and economic stability. We have evidence from legal and administrative tablets that palaces and temples, the primary patrons of large-scale metallurgy, enforced strict quality control standards. A scribe would record the exact amounts of raw copper and tin issued to a smith, and the smith was legally obligated to return a specific quantity of finished bronze of a guaranteed quality. If the yield was too low or the metal was brittle and inferior, the smith could be held financially responsible for the lost materials. This system of royal accountability was an early form of industrial standardization. It ensured that a soldier could rely on the strength of his bronze spearhead in battle, and that a farmer's plow wouldn't snap during the critical planting season. The law was used to build trust in a complex technological product, guaranteeing a standard of excellence that fueled both the economy and the military. Most astonishingly, we find the faint, early echoes of what we would now call intellectual property rights. While there were no formal patents as we understand them today, the legal system did recognize and seek to reward innovation. This often took the form of royal grants or privileges. A clever inventor who designed a more efficient water-lifting device or a new method for tempering metal might be granted an exclusive, temporary right to profit from his invention, often sanctioned by a royal decree recorded on, you guessed it, a clay tablet. In one documented case, a craftsman who developed a new glassmaking technique was given a monopoly on its production for a period of 5 years. This wasn't just a gift, it was a calculated economic policy. The king understood that by offering a temporary exclusive right, he was incentivizing other artisans to share their valuable discoveries with the state, rather than hoarding their knowledge as secret family traditions. This early system balanced the public's interest in acquiring new technology with the private inventor's right to benefit from their intellectual labor, a core tension that still defines modern patent law. Legal historians see a direct conceptual line between these ancient practices and our own complex world of intellectual property. The fundamental challenge remains identical. How do you encourage the immense investment of time and resources required for innovation, while also ensuring that society as a whole eventually benefits from the resulting technology? The ancient solution was a state-granted, time-limited monopoly, exactly the principle that underpins today's patent systems. The medium was different, a clay tablet versus a digital database, but the underlying social bargain is thousands of years old. It reveals a continuous human understanding that progress doesn't happen by accident. It must be cultivated through a legal framework that rewards risk and creativity while keeping the public good in clear sight. This examination completely overturns the image of ancient rulers as mere conquerors or religious figureheads. They were also the world's first technology policymakers. They used the law as a strategic tool to foster a culture of innovation, to manage the risks that came with new technologies, and to integrate technological progress into the broader project of building a stable and prosperous civilization. They understood that a well-regulated water wheel was as important to the empire's health as a well-trained army, and that a standard ingot of bronze was a foundation of economic trust. This forward-thinking spirit, etched into countless clay tablets, shows us that the drive to harness technology for the betterment of society and to wisely govern its power is one of the most enduring and noble legacies of these early empires. Yet for all the care taken in crafting these tablets, their long-term survival was never guaranteed. The very medium of clay, while durable, was also fragile before firing. A dropped tablet could shatter, a misplaced document could be moistened and reused, its legal contents lost forever. To combat this, the ancients developed sophisticated archival systems that were the nerve centers of their empires. These were not mere storage rooms but highly organized libraries, often located within the secure walls of palaces or temples. Tablets were sorted by subject, date, or case number, stored on shelves, in baskets, or within clay jars that protected them from the elements. Smaller tablets served as labels and indexes, acting as a primitive cataloging system that allowed a scribe to locate a specific contract or legal ruling from years or even decades past. The archive at the city of Mari is a stunning example, where over 20,000 tablets were found in a single complex, their very organization reflecting a bureaucratic mind that understood the power of information retrieval. This meticulous filing system meant the law was not a static monument but a living, breathing resource, constantly referenced and applied, creating a continuous thread of legal precedent that connected generations of judges and administrators. The guardians of this living tradition were the scribble schools, the adabas or tablet houses. Here, the art of legal preservation was passed down through a rigorous, multi-generational apprenticeship. A senior scribe, a master of his craft, would guide students through the painstaking process of copying existing law codes. This was not simple rote memorization. It was an act of deep immersion and interpretation. A student wouldn't just copy Hammurabi's code. He would learn its phrasing, its nuances, its applications in different scenarios. This process of constant reproduction served a dual purpose. It trained new scribes in the standardized language of the law, and it created new copies of vital texts to replace those that wore out or were lost. In this way, the scribble schools functioned as the ancient world's printing presses and law schools combined, ensuring that legal knowledge was not concentrated in a single, vulnerable copy, but was disseminated and reinforced across the empire, creating a resilient network of legal expertise that could withstand the fall of a dynasty or the destruction of a city. This system of transmission was not meant to fossilize the law, but to allow it to breathe and adapt. We have fascinating examples of tablets that show clear evidence of legal revision. A scribe might add a new clause in the margin, or a later hand might score through an obsolete penalty and write the updated punishment above it. In some cases, entire sections of a law code were reworked for a new king, who would issue a Misharam Act, a royal edict that often cancelled certain types of debt and updated specific laws to reflect new economic or social realities. These amendments were then incorporated into the master copies held in the archives and recopied by the scribal schools. This reveals a dynamic legal culture that respected the authority of the written word but was not enslaved by it. The law was seen as a cumulative project, a growing body of wisdom that could be refined and improved by each generation, always anchored by the core principles of justice and order established by their ancestors. Modern conservators working in museums today are the direct heirs to these ancient scribes, and their work reveals why we can still read these texts millennia later. They explain that the primary reason for the tablet's survival was often catastrophe. A city sacked and burned might seem like a total loss, but the intense heat of the fires baked the clay tablets that had been sun-dried, accidentally firing them into permanent ceramic. In arid regions, tablets that were never fired simply dried out and remained intact in the ruins, protected from rain and moisture by the very rubble that buried them. Today, these conservators use advanced technology like three-dimensional scanning and reflectance transformation imaging to digitally enhance faded inscriptions and even virtually open clay envelopes without physically breaking them, revealing contracts inside that haven't been seen by human eyes in over 3,000 years. This marriage of ancient durability and modern innovation allows us to recover texts once thought lost forever, giving us an ever clearer window into the legal minds of the past. This relentless, centuries-long project of preservation underscores a profound cultural value that these early empires held dear, the imperative to speak to the future. They understood that their achievements, their laws, their very identity would be erased by time if not physically saved. By inscribing their laws in clay and building institutions dedicated to their perpetual care, they were engaging in a conversation across the centuries. They were sending a message that their struggles for justice, their hard-won wisdom, and their blueprint for an orderly society were too valuable to be lost. This act of preservation was the greatest gift they could give to future generations, including our own. It was a declaration that knowledge is the true legacy of a civilization, and its careful transmission is the sacred duty that binds humanity together across the vast expanse of time. This chain of knowledge, stretching from a Sumerian scribe carefully forming a wedge with his stylus to a modern scholar using a digital scanner to read it, is one of the most enduring and powerful mysteries of all, the human desire to ensure that our stories and our laws never truly die. The journey of these ancient legal principles did not end with the collapse of the Mesopotamian empires. Instead, they embarked on a vast, millennia-long migration, carried on the currents of trade, conquest, and intellectual curiosity, to find new homes in the legal foundations of the world's most influential civilizations. The rigid yet remarkably fair frameworks first pressed into clay became the genetic code for Western legal thought, mutating and adapting as they were absorbed by the Greeks, refined by the Romans, and preserved through the Middle Ages to eventually re-emerge as the bedrock of our modern concepts of justice. This is a story of intellectual inheritance on a grand scale, proving that the most enduring legacy of an empire is not its monuments, but its laws. When we consider the grandeur of Roman law, we often picture it as a unique and unparalleled achievement of Latin genius. But the Romans were master synthesizers, brilliant adapters who absorbed the best ideas from every culture they encountered. As their empire expanded into the Eastern Mediterranean, their legal scholars came into direct contact with the long-standing legal traditions of the Greek city-states, which themselves had been influenced by centuries of trade and interaction with the Near East. The Greek concept of a written law code that applied to all citizens, or isonomia, echoes the public steles of Hammurabi. The Romans saw the utility in these established systems, particularly in the complex commercial world they now governed. They recognized the need for precise, written rules to manage contracts across vast distances, to clearly define property rights for a burgeoning class of landowners, and to establish standardized procedures for litigation. In these areas, the debt to Mesopotamian predecessors is striking. The Roman law of contracts, with its emphasis on good faith and its detailed formulations for sales, leases, and partnerships, follows a logical path first laid out by the merchant courts of Assyria and Babylon. Similarly, the Roman focus on absolute, defensible property rights, documented on wax tablets instead of clay, is a direct conceptual descendant of the meticulous land sale agreements of Sumer. The Romans didn't simply copy, they systematized. They took these proven principles and built around them the elaborate superstructure of Roman jurisprudence, creating a legal language so precise and comprehensive that it remains the foundation of civil law in most of Europe and Latin America today. For centuries after the fall of Rome, the sophisticated light of its legal tradition flickered low in Europe, kept alive in the scriptoria of monasteries and the courts of a few enlightened rulers. The great rediscovery came during the Renaissance, when European scholars, hungry for the knowledge of the classical world, unearthed and began to study ancient Roman legal texts with fresh eyes. This wasn't just an academic exercise, it was a revolution. Enlightenment philosophers like Montesquieu and John Locke pored over these texts, seeing in them not dusty old rules, but powerful blueprints for a new kind of society. They were inspired by the Roman idea that law could be a rational, secular framework for governing human affairs, separate from the arbitrary will of a monarch or the dogma of the church. This rediscovery fueled movements for constitutional government, the separation of powers, and the codification of national legal systems. As the historian Henry Maine famously observed, the progress of modern societies has been a movement from status to contract, a shift from rights determined by birth to rights determined by voluntary agreements between individuals. This profound idea, which lies at the heart of modern liberal democracy, finds its earliest and clearest expression not in 18th century Europe, but in the contract tablets of ancient Mesopotamia. The global impact of this legal migration is impossible to overstate. The principles of written statutory law, the reliance on precedent, and the very notion that a ruler is themselves subject to the law are all concepts that can trace their lineage back to the river valleys of the ancient Middle East. When the drafters of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights sat down after the Second World War to articulate a common standard of justice for all peoples, they were, whether they knew it or not, participating in a project that began 4,000 years earlier with kings like Ur-Nammu and Hammurabi proclaiming their duty to protect the weak from the strong. The legal scholar Martha Nussbaum has argued that this ancient focus on capabilities and human dignity provides a robust foundation for modern human rights law. The journey from a clause in the Code of Hammurabi to an article in the Geneva Conventions is long and winding, but the connective thread is the enduring human belief that our conflicts and our communities are best managed not by brute force, but by a set of rules that are known, predictable, and fair. This is the ultimate power of the legacy written in clay. It transformed law from a tool of power into a shield for humanity, a concept that continues to evolve and inspire the quest for justice in every corner of the world. Perhaps the most persistent and misleading myth about ancient law is the idea that it was nothing more than a blunt instrument of brutal, state-sanctioned revenge, a simplistic world of an eye for an eye, with no room for mercy, nuance, or fairness. This caricature, heavily promoted by Hollywood spectacles and adventure films, paints these early legal systems as primitive and unthinking, concerned only with maximum punishment. While the principle of retaliation, known as lex talionis, did exist, it was far from the default setting for justice. As we've seen, these codes were overwhelmingly focused on restitution and compensation, not mutilation. The famous eye for an eye clause in Hammurabi's code was a specific, limited provision for disputes between nobles of equal status, designed to prevent blood feuds by offering a state-enforced proportional conclusion. For the vast majority of people and the vast majority of offenses, the law prescribed fines of silver and barley, not bodily harm. This system of monetary compensation was sophisticated, calculating the economic impact of an injury, lost wages, medical costs, and pain and suffering, long before modern tort law existed. The goal was to repair the social fabric, not to tear it further apart with cycles of violence. Popular culture almost entirely ignores the extensive legal protections these codes offered to society's most vulnerable members, creating a false impression of universal oppression. The image of women in the ancient world is particularly distorted. They are often portrayed as mere property with no legal rights, yet the tablets tell a different story. While patriarchy was unquestionably the rule, the law provided women with crucial, enforceable safeguards. A Babylonian woman could own her own business, buy and sell property, and initiate divorce under specific conditions. Her dowry was not a gift to her husband. It remained her legal property, functioning as a form of pre-marital asset protection that was returned to her if the marriage ended, providing a critical economic safety net. Similarly, the poor were not simply left to their fate. Laws existed to protect debtors from perpetual slavery, setting limits on how long they could be held in service to work off a loan. Edicts from kings, known as Misharam Acts, would periodically cancel certain types of consumer debt altogether, a royal reset button designed to prevent the economy from seizing up and to protect small landowners from being completely swallowed by the wealthy elite. Another major misconception is that these were rigid, inflexible systems where judges merely read from a stone tablet and doled out predetermined sentences without consideration for context or evidence. The reality revealed in court records is that ancient justice was surprisingly procedural and evidence-based. Courts actively sought out witnesses and placed a high value on their testimony. Contracts and other documents were submitted as evidence, and their authenticity could be challenged. Judges considered factors like intent. The difference between premeditated murder and accidental homicide was legally significant and carried vastly different penalties. There were even avenues for appeal. A citizen who felt wronged by a local judge could petition the king or a higher official for a review of their case. This reveals a legal culture that valued truth and fairness over blind adherence to a written code. A system that understood justice required human judgment and a careful sifting of facts. So why do these simplistic myths persist so stubbornly in the public imagination? Historians point to a few key reasons. First, there's a tendency to view the past through a modern lens, a condescending assumption that anything ancient must be primitive. The dramatic and visceral nature of physical punishments also makes for better storytelling than the dry, bureaucratic process of calculating silver shekels in compensation. A scene of a dramatic eye gouging is far more cinematic than a scribe meticulously recording a payment to an injured farmer. Furthermore, the earliest translations and interpretations of these codes in the 19th century were often done by scholars who themselves lived in highly patriarchal and class-based societies, and they sometimes projected their own biases onto the ancient world, emphasizing the harsh hierarchies and downplaying the elements of protection and fairness. It has taken decades of meticulous re-examination by modern historians, often women and scholars from more diverse backgrounds, to uncover and highlight these subtler, more progressive aspects of the law. Correcting these misconceptions is not just an academic exercise, it is crucial for a true understanding of human history. It allows us to see these ancient people not as crude barbarians, but as sophisticated problem solvers who are grappling with the same eternal questions we face today. How to balance power with mercy, how to protect the weak from the strong, and how to use rules to create a stable and functional society. When we dismiss their legal systems as uniformly brutal, we blind ourselves to the origins of our own concepts of justice, contract law, and human rights. We miss the long, slow, and complex journey that has led to our modern world. Recognizing the nuance in ancient law allows us to appreciate the humanity of our ancestors, to see their struggles and their innovations, and to understand that the quest for a just society is a continuous, evolving conversation across thousands of years, one that began with the careful impression of a reed stylus into a slab of wet clay. Uncovering these ancient legal systems forces us to confront a delicate and profound ethical question. How do we judge the past without imposing our own modern values upon it? The work of a historian or archaeologist is not simply to dig up facts. It is to interpret a world that operated on a completely different set of assumptions. The greatest ethical pitfall they face is anachronism, the act of judging 4,000-year-old laws by 21st century standards. It is all too easy to look at the stark social hierarchies, the brutal punishments, or the limited rights of women in these codes and dismiss them as barbaric or backward. But this is a lazy and ultimately dishonest reading of history. The ethical challenge is to understand these laws within their own context, to see them as solutions to the specific problems of their time, crafted by people who are just as intelligent and morally complex as we are, but who are building a civilization from the ground up with entirely different tools and beliefs. This requires a form of intellectual humility. A scholar must temporarily suspend their own cultural framework to enter the mindset of an ancient Babylonian or Hittite. For instance, when we see a law that prescribes the death penalty for adultery, our modern sensibility recoils in horror. But if we pause and consider the context, we see a society where the certainty of paternity was the absolute foundation of inheritance, family lineage, and therefore social stability. In a world without DNA tests, a woman's fidelity was the only guarantee. The law, in its brutal way, was designed to protect that system, which was seen as essential for the survival of the community. This doesn't mean we must endorse the law, but we are ethically obligated to understand its purpose rather than simply condemning it from a distant moral high ground. The goal is explanation, not exoneration. The responsibility extends to how these findings are presented to the public. A historian has a duty to avoid sensationalism. It's more dramatic to headline an article, Hammurabi's Code of Brutality, than to write a nuanced piece about its complex system of restitution and social balance. Yet the latter is far more accurate and educationally valuable. Scholars must walk a tightrope, accurately representing the violence and inequality present in these texts without making them seem like the only defining features. This means always highlighting the progressive elements alongside the oppressive ones, the laws that protected slaves from excessive cruelty, the contracts that gave women economic agency, the edicts that protected the poor from debt slavery. Presenting this full, contradictory picture is the only way to honor the complexity of the past. Ethicists in the field of archaeology often speak about the principle of cultural sensitivity. This means recognizing that these ancient cultures are not dead experiments to be dissected, but the ancestors of living traditions and peoples. The artifacts and laws we study are part of a cultural heritage that deserves respect. This is especially important when studying human remains or sacred objects associated with legal rituals. Furthermore, there is a growing movement to include the perspectives of scholars from the modern regions where these civilizations flourished, ensuring that the interpretation of their own history is not dominated solely by Western academic viewpoints. This collaboration leads to richer, more nuanced, and more ethically sound understandings. Ultimately, the study of ancient law offers us a mirror as much as a window. These codes challenge us to question our own legal certainties. They ask us, what aspects of our own justice system will future historians look back on with the same mixture of horror and puzzled curiosity? What deeply held beliefs do we have about punishment, property, or personhood that are just as culturally specific as the laws we now study? The ethical takeaway is not that we should tolerate injustice because it was common in the past, but that we should approach history with humility, recognizing that our own moral framework is also a product of our time and place. This reflective practice is the greatest lesson these ancient legal systems teach us, a lesson in self-awareness that is crucial for anyone seeking to understand not just the past, but the enduring and evolving struggle for justice itself. We often imagine our modern legal systems as entirely new inventions, the product of Enlightenment thinking and centuries of progressive reform. But if you could trace the DNA of our laws back through time, you'd find a direct genetic link to those very first codes pressed into clay. The principles debated in our courtrooms and drafted into our constitutions are not sudden breakthroughs. They are the latest chapters in a story that began in the river valleys of Mesopotamia. Ancient law isn't a forgotten relic. It's a living resource, a deep well of innovation that modern legal thinkers are still drawing from today as they tackle some of society's most persistent challenges. Take the very concept of a written legal code itself. Before Hammurabi, law was often what the king said it was in any given moment, a fluid and unpredictable exercise of power. The revolutionary act of inscribing the laws on a public stele was a declaration that justice should not be arbitrary, that it should be knowable and applicable to everyone. This foundational idea that the rules governing society must be transparent and accessible is the bedrock of modern statutory law. Our entire system relies on the premise that you can't be punished for breaking a rule you couldn't possibly know about. This principle of legal publicity, so boldly asserted on that black stone pillar, echoes in every published legal code, every online statute database, and every requirement that new laws be officially recorded and disseminated. The medium has evolved from diorite to digital, but the core belief in the power of the written word to constrain power and ensure fairness remains unchanged. Beyond the written word, the substance of these ancient laws is experiencing a dramatic revival, particularly in the growing field of restorative justice. Our modern system is overwhelmingly retributive, focused on punishing the offender. But as prison populations swell and recidivism rates remain stubbornly high, many legal reformers are asking if there isn't a better way. In their search, they've looked way back to the codes of Ur-Nammu and Eshnunna. These ancient systems were primarily concerned with restitution, with repairing the harm done to the victim and the community. A broken bone was resolved with a payment of silver, calculated to cover the victim's medical costs and lost wages. This pragmatic, forward-looking approach is precisely what inspires modern restorative justice programs. These programs bring offenders face to face with their victims, not to determine punishment, but to agree on how the offender can actively make amends. This isn't a soft option. It's a challenging process that demands accountability in the most direct sense. As legal scholar David Daub once observed, the ancient Near Eastern focus on compensation created a system that was more about healing than hurting, a concept that modern reformers are now embracing to break the cycle of crime and punishment. The ancient world also offers powerful lessons for today's economic debates. We think of things like minimum wage laws and price controls as modern, even socialist innovations. Yet the laws of Eshnana included detailed, legally mandated price lists for essential goods like grain and oil, and set standard wages for different types of laborers. The goal wasn't to control the economy for its own sake, but to ensure stability and prevent the kind of exploitative price gouging that could tear a society apart during a famine. Today, as we grapple with extreme wealth inequality and the rising cost of living, some economists and policymakers are looking at these ancient models. They see in them a pragmatic acknowledgement that a truly free market requires rules to prevent its own self-destruction. The idea of using law to create a floor for wages and a ceiling for essential goods to ensure basic economic dignity for all is finding new resonance in contemporary discussions about a living wage and anti-profiteering regulations. This adaptive reuse of history is not about nostalgia, it's about innovation. It's the understanding that the past is a vast laboratory of human experience, full of experiments that worked and others that failed. By studying these experiments, we gain a deeper perspective on our own problems. We see that the challenges of justice, economic fairness, and social order are not new. They are the enduring human condition. The solutions crafted 4,000 years ago may not be directly applicable today, but they provide a starting point, a source of inspiration that can be adapted and refined with our modern knowledge. This backward glance is paradoxically the most forward-thinking thing we can do. It allows us to stand on the shoulders of the very first giants of law, to see further and dream bigger, and to continue the timeless human project of building a society that is not only orderly, but truly just. Yet to view these ancient legal systems through a single lens is to miss their profound complexity, particularly when it comes to the status of women. The popular imagination often casts the ancient woman as a mere possession, silent and powerless, her life entirely dictated by the men around her. While it is undeniable that these were deeply patriarchal societies where a woman's primary identity was defined through her relationship to a man, as a daughter, a wife, or a widow, the legal reality preserved on clay tablets reveals a far more textured and surprising picture. The law did not simply oppress women, it also carved out specific, legally enforceable spaces where they could exercise significant autonomy, own property, and defend their rights in a court of law. Their legal personhood was constrained, but it was never completely erased, offering a fascinating glimpse into the nuanced ways ancient societies balanced rigid hierarchy with pragmatic necessity. The legal codes of the Hittites, an empire based in what is now Turkey, provide some of the most striking examples of this nuanced approach. In a society renowned for its martial prowess, the law granted women a remarkable degree of economic independence. A Hittite woman could not only own property in her own nameland, livestock, household goods, but she could also dispose of it as she saw fit through sales or gifts, without requiring permission from her husband or a male guardian. This was not a rare occurrence. We have numerous tablets recording such transactions. Furthermore, Hittite laws concerning marriage were surprisingly balanced. While adultery was severely punished for both parties, the laws also protected a woman from being arbitrarily discarded. If a man wished to divorce his wife without established cause, he was obligated to provide her with substantial financial compensation and the return of her dowry, ensuring she was not left destitute. This legal framework recognized that a dissolved marriage had serious economic consequences for a woman, and the law acted as a crucial safety net. Moving to the Neo-Babylonian period centuries later, we find a bustling commercial society where women were active and legally recognized participants in the economy. The archives from cities like Sippar and Babylon are filled with contracts showing women as entrepreneurs. They ran taverns, owned and managed date palm orchards, and lent large sums of silver at interest as professional money lenders. One particularly vivid tablet records a business partnership between a woman named Aristi and a man named Nadin. They pooled their capital to finance a trading venture, with a contract meticulously outlining their respective investments and their agreed-upon split of the profits. In court, women appeared regularly as both plaintiffs and defendants. A woman could sue a negligent tenant for failing to pay the rent on her property, or she could be sued for failing to deliver on a contract. Her testimony was heard and weighed by the judges alongside that of men. This was not equality as we define it today, but it was a form of legal agency that challenges our simplest assumptions about the ancient world. A woman's experience, however, was never monolithic. It was powerfully shaped by her social class and, most importantly, her marital status. The highest status women, such as priestesses, often held the most privilege. The Nadatu women of Sippar, who were dedicated to the sun god Shamash, were prohibited from marrying and having children, but in return, they received a superb education and were freed from the control of a husband. They became formidable businesswomen, managing vast estates and building significant personal wealth, all under the protection of the temple. For the vast majority of women, marriage was the central legal event of their lives. A young woman entered marriage with a dowry provided by her father, which remained her separate property. This was not a gift to the husband's family, it was her financial anchor. If her husband died, this dowry, along with any inheritance he might have left her, provided her livelihood. If he divorced her unjustly, the law often mandated its return. This economic provision gave a wife a degree of leverage and security within the marriage. Feminist historians have powerfully reframed our understanding of these legal provisions. They argue that we should not dismiss these rights as mere tokens within an oppressive system, but should instead see them as evidence of women's active negotiation for power within the constraints of their time. These were not rights generously bestowed by benevolent male lawmakers. They were more likely hard-won concessions, the result of centuries of women's practical need to survive and protect their children. The legal protections for widows, for instance, can be seen as societal recognition that the stability of the entire community depended on preventing widows and orphans from falling into absolute destitution. This perspective allows us to see ancient women not as passive victims of their legal system, but as active agents who used the tools available to them to carve out lives of dignity, respect, and sometimes even influence. Their stories, painstakingly recorded on clay, remind us that the struggle for gender equity is not a modern invention, but a deeply human story with ancient roots. While the great legal codes of antiquity were busy regulating commerce and punishing crime, they were also quietly engaged in a more intimate project, safeguarding the most vulnerable members of society. The well-being of children was not a private family matter, but a vital concern of the state. intricately woven into the legal fabric that held these early empires together. In a world with high infant mortality and constant economic precarity, children represented the future, the next generation of soldiers, farmers, scribes, and mothers. Their survival and proper integration into the family unit were essential for social stability, economic continuity, and the preservation of bloodlines. The law, therefore, stepped in as a powerful guardian, creating a framework of rules around adoption, inheritance, and guardianship designed to ensure that every child had a place and a purpose, and that no child's potential was lost to neglect or chaos. The Code of Hammurabi provides some of the most detailed and revealing provisions on this front, particularly concerning the fate of children who found themselves outside the protection of a traditional family. The code outlines specific responsibilities for the care of orphans. If a child's parents died, the law did not leave them to chance or charity. It mandated that their inheritance, their share of the family's land, livestock, or silver, be held in trust by an appointed guardian, often an uncle or older sibling. This guardian was legally permitted to manage the assets and use the income for the child's upkeep, but they were strictly forbidden from selling or squandering the capital. When the child came of age, the entire inheritance had to be returned to them, intact. This was a remarkably forward-thinking concept of a trust fund, designed to protect a vulnerable young person from predatory relatives and ensure they could enter adulthood with the means to establish their own household. The law even anticipated conflict, stating that if a guardian tried to cheat the orphan out of their inheritance, they could be forced to pay back triple the value. The legal status of children born into slavery presented an even more complex challenge, and the law's approach reveals its stark pragmatism. A child born to an enslaved woman was legally a slave themselves, considered the property of the mother's owner. However, the law did offer a few narrow paths to a different future. If a free man had children with a slave woman, those children would normally remain slaves. But if the father formally acknowledged them and secured the master's consent, he could have them legitimized and freed. Furthermore, the code contained a fascinating provision that if a man's first wife gave him children, and then his slave woman also bore him children, upon his death the children of the slave woman could not be disinherited. They were to receive a share of the inheritance alongside their free-born half-siblings, though the son of the first wife would have the right of first choice. This wasn't about modern equality. It was about ensuring that all of a man's offspring were provided for and integrated into the social structure, preventing them from becoming a dispossessed and potentially disruptive class. Adoption was another area where the law provided clear and careful structure, and the surviving adoption contracts are among the most human documents we have from this period. Childlessness was a profound tragedy in the ancient world, representing not just personal grief but a dead end for one's lineage and a failure in one's duty to the ancestors. Adoption was the solution. The process was not informal. It was a serious legal procedure, recorded on a tablet and witnessed by officials. A typical adoption contract from the city of Nuzi details the adoption of a young boy named Ziggy. The tablet states that his new parents shall treat him as a son, and if they do not treat Ziggy as a son, they shall pay a substantial fine of 1 mina of silver to the temple. This clause was crucial. It legally bound the adoptive parents to provide the same care, education, and inheritance rights they would give a biological child. In return, the adopted child was legally obligated to care for his adoptive parents in their old age and perform the essential funeral rites after their death. This was a reciprocal contract, creating a legally enforceable bond of kinship that was considered as real and as sacred as a blood relation. These ancient concepts of child welfare, while born from a different world with different values, offer surprising points of comparison with our own modern practices. Legal historian Dr. Amanda Podany notes that the Babylonian idea of holding an inheritance in trust for an orphan is a direct precursor to our modern probate courts and guardianship systems. The emphasis on a child's right to their patrimony, protected from exploitative adults, is a principle we still struggle to uphold today. Similarly, the formal, court-supervised process of ancient adoption, focused on the best interests of creating a stable family unit, mirrors the rigorous home studies and legal finalizations of contemporary adoptions. The core motivation is identical: to provide a parentless child with a secure and loving home. Of course, the differences are vast. Our modern framework is built on the concept of the child's inherent rights and psychological well-being, whereas the ancient model was primarily concerned with legal status, economic stability, and the continuation of the family line. Yet both systems, separated by millennia, recognize that society has a collective responsibility to ensure that no child is left behind. This enduring focus on nurturing the young, on weaving a legal safety net beneath the most vulnerable, is a powerful testament to a shared human impulse that transcends time and culture: the desire to protect the future, one child at a time. We often picture ancient civilizations as existing in a state of harmony with nature, but the reality preserved on clay tablets is far more complex and far more interesting. These early empires were not passive inhabitants of their environment. They were aggressive manipulators of it, building vast networks of canals to redirect rivers and clearing forests to fuel their cities and smelt their metals. This massive transformation of the landscape came with a cost, and remarkably, the lawmakers of the time were acutely aware of it. They recognized that the very resources that fueled their rise, water, wood, and wildlife, were finite and vulnerable to human greed and carelessness. Their response was to weave environmental protection directly into the legal code, creating the world's first sustainability laws, a sophisticated system of regulations designed to balance human ambition with ecological responsibility, ensuring that their prosperity would not become the cause of their own collapse. The most urgent and meticulously regulated resource was, unsurprisingly, water. In the arid plains of Mesopotamia, a field without water was a field that produced nothing. The entire economy rested on the shoulders of a complex, man-made irrigation system, but this system was incredibly fragile. A single landowner's negligence could have catastrophic consequences for an entire district. The laws of Hammurabi tackle this threat head-on with stunning specificity. One law states that if a man is too lazy to reinforce the bank of his irrigation ditch, and subsequently that bank collapses and floods his neighbor's field, the negligent farmer must make restitution. He is required to compensate his neighbor for every single bushel of grain lost in the flood. This wasn't a minor fine. It was a full-scale economic reckoning designed to make negligence financially unthinkable. The law didn't stop there. It made the man who caused the breach responsible for the back-breaking labor of repairing the damaged ditch, using his own resources to restore the communal infrastructure his carelessness had broken. This created a powerful financial and physical incentive for every single citizen to become a vigilant steward of the water system upon which all their lives depended. Beyond the farm, the law also sought to protect the wild resources that were essential for survival and commerce. The Hittite laws, originating from the forested highlands of Anatolia, show a keen awareness of the need to manage hunting and forestry. While they lacked our modern concept of conservation for its own sake, they practiced a ruthless form of resource pragmatism. The code includes specific values for different types of timber and live animals, but it also regulates their harvest. There is strong evidence that the Hittite kingdom maintained royal forests, effectively creating the world's first protected reserves. Hunting in these areas was likely controlled not for sport, but to ensure a sustainable supply of game meat, hides, and other animal products for the state's needs. The penalty for stealing a prized plow ox was severe, but so was the penalty for setting an unauthorized fire that destroyed a pasture or a woodlot. This was a recognition that the value of a living, productive ecosystem far exceeded the value of any single animal or tree within it. The law was used to protect the entire system, understanding that its destruction would be an economic catastrophe. What's truly fascinating is how these practical regulations were often wrapped in a layer of religious belief, giving them an unshakable moral authority. For the ancient mind, a river wasn't just water, it was a god. A forest was not just trees, it was the home of deities and spirits. To pollute a river was not just a civil violation, it was an act of impiety that could bring divine retribution upon the whole community. This fusion of the practical and the spiritual is powerfully illustrated in the Hittite laws concerning water pollution. One statute imposes a heavy fine on anyone who deliberately contaminates a public well or spring. The reasoning is both spiritual and sanitary. The act defiles a sacred source of life and simultaneously threatens the health of everyone who drinks from it. This dual motivation made the law incredibly resilient. A citizen might be tempted to cheat a neighbor, but few would dare risk angering the river god, who could respond with drought or plague. The law cleverly harnessed this deep-seated religious fear to enforce behavior that was, from a purely practical standpoint, essential for public health and survival. The day-to-day application of these laws comes to life in the court records. One tablet from the ancient city of Ur-Nammu details a bitter dispute between two communities over water rights. During a severe drought, upstream farmers had diverted more than their allotted share of canal water, leaving the downstream fields to wither. The case wasn't settled by a brawl, it was brought before a court. Scribes were called to consult the official irrigation schedules. Witnesses from both communities gave testimony. In the end, the judges ruled in favor of the downstream farmers, ordering the upstream group to restore the water flow and pay compensation for the damaged crops. This case shows that environmental law was not an abstract concept. It was a living, breathing system of justice that real people used to resolve real conflicts over scarce resources. It provided a peaceful, ordered alternative to the water wars that could have torn the region apart. Modern environmental historians look at these ancient practices with a sense of awe and poignant recognition. They see in them a proto-concept of the tragedy of the commons, the economic theory that individuals acting in their own self-interest will ultimately deplete a shared resource. The Mesopotamians and Hittites arrived at this understanding not through academic study, but through brutal experience. Their solution clearly defined rules, strict liability for damages, and community-based enforcement is precisely what modern economists like Elinor Ostrom, who won a Nobel Prize for her work on this very topic, have identified as the key to managing common resources sustainably. The lessons are starkly relevant today. As we grapple with global climate change and resource depletion, we are essentially facing the same challenges on a planetary scale that these ancient farmers faced in a single river valley. Their response teaches us that sustainability is not a new age ideal, it is an ancient and practical necessity. It shows that the law has always been one of humanity's most powerful tools for imposing order on our own appetites, for forcing us to see the long-term consequences of our short-term actions, and for reminding us that our survival is inextricably linked to the health of the world we have been given to steward. Imagine holding a tablet so badly fire-damaged that its surface is a glazed, featureless lump, or so fragmented that it's just one of 1,000 pieces in a museum box. For over a century, these artifacts held their secrets tightly, their stories locked away by the very forces that preserved them. But that is changing now at a breathtaking pace. We are standing at the dawn of a new golden age of discovery, not because we're digging faster, but because we've built better keys. The future of understanding our legal past is being written not with a stylus, but with spectral imaging, artificial intelligence, and global digital collaboration. This isn't just an upgrade, it's a revolution that is allowing these ancient tablets to speak again, often in voices we never expected to hear. The most powerful of these new keys is a suite of technologies that allow us to see what the naked eye cannot. One of the most exciting is reflectance transformation imaging, or RTI. This process involves taking dozens of high-resolution photographs of a tablet from every possible angle, each with a light source positioned in a different spot. A sophisticated software algorithm then combines all these images into a single, dynamic digital file. A scholar can now sit at a computer screen and virtually move the light across the surface of the tablet, enhancing the faintest scratches and impressions. Wedges that were utterly invisible under normal light suddenly pop into stark relief, as if they were freshly inscribed. Even more advanced, researchers are now using micro-CT scanning, the same technology used to image human organs, to create three-dimensional models of sealed clay envelopes. They can digitally unfold these envelopes without ever breaking them, reading the sensitive contract inside while leaving the outer layer, with its precious seals and signatures, completely intact for future study. This allows us to access the information without destroying the unique archaeological context of the artifact itself. This is where artificial intelligence enters the picture, not as a replacement for human scholars, but as their most powerful assistant. Deciphering cuneiform is a phenomenally specialized skill. There are very few people in the world who can do it, and a single tablet can take weeks or months to translate. AI is changing that equation. Projects like the Deep Scribe initiative are training neural networks on thousands of already translated tablets. The AI learns the complex patterns of the script, the grammar of Akkadian and Sumerian, and the common formulae used in legal documents. Now, when a new tablet is scanned, the AI can provide a preliminary, first-pass translation, highlighting uncertain passages for a human expert to review. This doesn't put Assyriologists out of a job. It supercharges them, allowing a single scholar to process and analyze fragments at a scale that was previously unimaginable. It's like giving every researcher a team of 1,000 tireless, hyper-specialized interns. And the new discoveries haven't stopped. Archaeological excavations continue to yield fresh archives, each one capable of rewriting a paragraph in our history books. Major international digs are ongoing across Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Iran. At the ancient site of Kanish in Turkey, archaeologists have uncovered thousands of tablets from a merchant colony, providing an incredibly detailed view of international trade law and dispute resolution between Assyrian traders and the local Anatolian population. In Iraq, teams are carefully excavating new areas of ancient cities like Ur and Lhasa, often finding tablets that had been recycled as building material or discarded in trash heaps, which ironically preserved them perfectly. Every season in the field promises the potential for a new find, a previously unknown law code, a treaty between empires we didn't know were in contact, or a court record that reveals how a specific law was applied in a real human conflict. The ground hasn't given up all its secrets yet. This flood of new data is fueling an intensely interdisciplinary approach. The old model of a lone historian working in a dusty archive is giving way to vibrant collaborations between philologists, data scientists, legal theorists, and even chemists. Chemists can now analyze the very clay of a tablet, tracing its mineral composition back to a specific riverbank or region, which can tell us if a treaty was written locally or imported from a foreign capital. Network analysts can take thousands of legal documents and map the relationships between the people mentioned in them, the judges, the witnesses, the plaintiffs, revealing the social networks of power and influence in an ancient city. Legal philosophers are partnering with historians to ask bigger questions about the diffusion of ideas. How did the concept of a just price move from Eshnunna to Babylon? Was it through trade, conquest, or the movement of scribes? These collaborations are turning the study of ancient law from a descriptive field into an explanatory one, helping us understand not just what the laws were, but how they evolved and why they spread. Experts in the field are buzzing with predictions for what the next few decades will reveal. Many believe we are on the cusp of understanding the legal systems of the so-called minor empires much more deeply: the Elamites, the Hurrians, the Urartians. Their records are fewer and more poorly understood, but new technologies are making them accessible. We might discover that they had entirely unique approaches to justice that we never suspected. Others predict we will finally grasp the daily, practical application of law on a street level. The grand codes of kings are one thing, but how did a local sheriff in a small town enforce the rules? How did ordinary people who couldn't read know what the law was? The answers likely lie in the thousands of mundane administrative tablets that are only now being read, which will paint a vivid picture of law as a lived experience, not just a royal decree. This future is bright with possibility, a promise that the next chapter in the story of ancient law will be its most revealing yet, showing us not just the rules they lived by, but how those rules truly shaped the human experience in the dawn of civilization. It's easy to look at these ancient clay tablets and see them as artifacts from a distant, disconnected past, relics under glass that have nothing to do with our digital, fast-paced world. But that distance is an illusion. The struggles etched into these tablets are the very same struggles that headline our news feeds and dominate our political debates today. The concerns of a Babylonian merchant trusting a business partner 1,000 miles away are the same concerns you have when you enter your credit card information online. The Sumerian farmer appealing to the king for justice against a corrupt local official is participating in the same fundamental human drama as a modern citizen advocating for government transparency. These laws matter to you today because they are the foundational code of our shared human operating system, the first attempts to answer questions we are still wrestling with. What is fair? Who gets to decide, and how do we build a society that works for everyone, not just the powerful? Consider the timeless tension between individual rights and collective security. The Code of Hammurabi was obsessed with this balance. Its strict penalties for false accusation were designed to protect an individual from being crushed by the state or a malicious neighbor. Yet its collective responsibility for maintaining irrigation ditches forced every individual to act for the common good. We are having this exact same debate today. How do we craft laws that protect personal privacy while also allowing for necessary security measures? How do we mandate vaccinations or environmental regulations for public health without infringing on personal freedoms? The ancient Mesopotamians didn't have the technology, but they perfectly understood the problem. Their solutions were imperfect, often brutal, but they established the crucial principle that law is the essential tool for navigating this eternal conflict. Their 4,000-year-old experiment is a data point in humanity's long quest to get this balance right, and ignoring their experience is like trying to write new software without ever looking at the original code. The drive for economic fairness is another thread that runs unbroken from then to now. The Laws of Eshnana, with their fixed prices for essential goods like barley and oil, were an early form of consumer protection. They were designed to prevent predatory price gouging during a famine, to ensure that a basic level of economic dignity was available to all. Fast forward to today, and we see the same intent behind minimum wage laws, rent control debates, and antitrust lawsuits against powerful corporations. The context is light years apart, but the core issue is identical. How does a society prevent the powerful from exploiting the vulnerable within a market system? When you hear a politician argue for a living wage, they are, in spirit, channeling the ancient lawmakers of Eshnunna, who understood that a stable society requires rules to prevent the market from eating itself. Their pragmatic approach reminds us that economic regulation isn't a modern socialist invention. It's an ancient tool for maintaining social stability. Perhaps the most powerful connection is in the ongoing, painful, and vital struggle for equality. The stark social hierarchies of ancient law can make us uncomfortable, and they should. But within those rigid structures, we also find the first faint cracks in the wall. The laws that protected a Mesopotamian widow's right to her dowry or a slave's path to manumission through a legal contract were small but significant victories. They represent the very beginning of the idea that even the lowest members of society possess a shred of inviolable legal personhood. This is the humble origin point of a journey that leads through the Magna Carta, the abolitionist movement, the suffragettes, and the civil rights era, all the way to today's global movements for gender and racial equality. The journey is far from over. When we fight for equal pay or against systemic discrimination, we are continuing a battle that was first joined in those ancient courtrooms. We are standing on the shoulders of everyone who ever used the law, however imperfectly, to demand that their humanity be seen and their dignity respected. This isn't just about drawing interesting parallels. It's about engaging with history as a living dialogue, a conversation across time. These clay tablets are not dead things, they are messages. They tell us what worked and what failed catastrophically. They show us the unintended consequences of well-intentioned rules and the surprising ways people found to carve out justice within unjust systems. This is the ultimate value of looking back. It gives us perspective. It humbles us by showing that our current debates are not unique, and it inspires us by showing that progress, though agonizingly slow, is possible. It reminds us that the law is not a divine, unchanging truth, but a human invention, constantly being revised and rewritten by every generation. The past doesn't give us easy answers for today's problems, but it provides a deeper set of questions and a longer timeline for understanding what truly makes a society just, resilient, and humane. The story written in clay is ultimately our story, and it's one we are still writing every single day. So as we bring our journey to a close, we find ourselves back where we began, holding that small, sun-baked piece of clay in our mind's eye. But now it feels entirely different, doesn't it? It's no longer just a relic, it's a portal. We've traveled across 4,000 years and countless human stories, from the bustling marketplaces of Ur to the majestic palaces of Babylon, guided by the wedge-shaped marks left by scribes who could never have imagined their work would speak to us today. We've seen how these fragile tablets preserved the very architecture of civilization, the first written laws that moved humanity from the uncertainty of oral tradition to the permanence of the written word, creating a foundation of order that would support empires and inspire legal thought for millennia to come. Think of the incredible diversity we've uncovered. This wasn't a single, monolithic system of justice, but a vibrant conversation happening across the ancient world. We met the pragmatic merchants of Eshnunna, whose laws read like a detailed economic manual, setting fixed prices and interest rates to build trust in the marketplace. We saw the nuanced vision of Ur-Nammu, who centuries before Hammurabi championed restitution over retaliation, preferring fines of silver to broken bones. We witnessed the Hittites weaving public health regulations into their legal fabric, holding citizens accountable for keeping water clean and buildings safe. Each empire, each city-state, added its own unique voice to this grand dialogue, proving that the human quest for justice has always been a multifaceted and deeply creative endeavor. Perhaps the most enduring revelation is the stunning sophistication of ancient justice. These were not primitive systems of brutal revenge but complex, evolving structures designed for one primary purpose: to maintain social harmony. They understood the difference between intentional malice and accidental harm. They valued witness testimony and written evidence. Their courts could show remarkable flexibility, considering context and intent in their rulings. They balanced the harsh realities of social hierarchy with surprising protections for the vulnerable, offering women economic safeguards through the dowry system and providing slaves with legally enforceable pathways to freedom. This wasn't a world of simple black and white, but a rich tapestry of grays, where the law served as a crucial tool for managing the intricate and often contradictory demands of a growing society. And the most powerful mystery of all is how deeply relevant these ancient struggles remain. The core challenges they faced are the very ones that dominate our headlines and courtrooms today. How do we balance individual rights with the collective good? How do we regulate a complex economy to prevent the strong from exploiting the weak? How do we ensure that our laws evolve to address new technologies and social realities? The specific answers have changed, but the fundamental questions have not. Every time we debate a living wage, a consumer protection law, or a new environmental regulation, we are participating in a conversation that began on the plains of Mesopotamia. These clay tablets remind us that our modern world is built upon layers of ancient wisdom, and that the quest for a fair and orderly society is humanity's oldest and most continuous project. Ultimately, each one of these tablets is a testament to hope. It is a message in clay, a deliberate attempt to reach across the centuries and speak to the future. The kings and scribes who created them believed that their efforts, their hard-won wisdom, their blueprint for a better world, was too valuable to be lost to time. They believed in the power of the written word to shape a more just tomorrow, and in that they were profoundly correct. These artifacts connect us to our shared human past in the most intimate way possible, reminding us that we are part of a story much larger than ourselves. They are a powerful reminder that the desire to create a better society through law is one of the most enduring and noble aspects of the human spirit. So I encourage you to keep exploring, to keep asking questions, and to look for these connections in your own world. The past is not a closed book, it's an ongoing conversation. And I would love to hear your thoughts. What part of this legacy in clay resonated most with you? Share your reflections in the comments below. Thank you so much for joining me on this